He was worshipped like a saint and feared like the devil. To some, he was a hero of the poor. To others, he was a cold-blooded terrorist who turned an entire nation into a war zone. He made $420 million a week, buried cash in fields, burned it to stay warm, and built a prison just to escape it. He ordered bombings, hijackings, and assassinations, then handed out food to children on the same day. This is not just the story of a drug lord. This is the story of a man who tried to outgun a country and almost won. This is Pablo Escobar. And this is the terrifying truth they never wanted you to hear. Chapter 1. Born into Dust, the Early Life of Escobar. They say the devil wasn't born in a palace. He came screaming into the world in a place that barely held together. December 1st, 1949. Rio Negro, Colombia. A rural hospital surrounded by dirt roads, overgrown hills, and silence, broken only by the sounds of cattle and the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Inside that modest hospital, a woman gave birth to a child who would one day set the world on fire. The boy's name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. He weighed less than most newborns, cried louder than most, too, as if, even then, he knew the world owed him something, and he planned to collect. Pablo's family wasn't poor by peasant standards, but they weren't rich either. His father, a hard-working farmer with calloused hands and a quiet soul, spent most of his days breaking earth with a shovel. His mother, a schoolteacher, believed in rules, discipline, and God. But rules don't hold the same power when your house is surrounded by dust and desperation. The world Pablo was born into had already decided the odds, and they weren't in his favor. Not long after his birth, the family moved to the outskirts of Medellin, a city already bleeding from political violence. In the 50s, Colombia wasn't just unstable. It was a live wire. The nation was split down the middle. Liberals and conservatives didn't just argue. They killed each other in the streets. Thousands died in a silent civil war known only as La Violencia. It was into this simmering chaos that Pablo Escobar took his first steps. He learned early that justice wasn't about laws. It was about leverage. As a boy, Pablo watched his mother stretch every coin, sometimes sacrificing her own meals to keep her children fed. He hated the sound of an empty kitchen, hated the way people looked at his shoes when they were worn through. Most of all, he hated being invisible. He decided he'd never be overlooked again. By the time he was 10, Pablo was selling stolen tombstones. He'd sneak into cemeteries at night with older boys, lift headstones off graves, sand off the names, and resell them to crooked funeral homes. He wasn't scared. He was thrilled. Money felt like oxygen. And once he tasted it, he couldn't breathe without it. School didn't interest him much. He was clever, gifted even, but uninterested in authority. Teachers noticed his potential, but they also noticed something else. A shadow behind his eyes. A quiet defiance that never quite turned into violence, but always hovered nearby. He could charm one minute, intimidate the next. He wasn't the loudest, but he was the one people remembered. In the back alleys of Medellin, he learned that reputation was currency. If people feared you, they respected you. If they respected you, they paid you. Pablo started running errands for petty smugglers and bootleggers. By 13, he was earning more than his teachers. By 15, he'd already tasted his first real power, making local cops look the other way in exchange for a little cash and a polite smile. Colombia was changing. The countryside was drying out. Cocoa plants, once just part of ancient tradition, were becoming something else. A white powder, small enough to hide in a suitcase, valuable enough to build an empire. Cocaine. Not many knew what it was in the 60s, but a few did, and Pablo watched them carefully. At 16, he told a friend he would one day be president of Colombia. He didn't say it like a dream. He said it like a fact. There was no smirk, no laugh, just certainty. He didn't mean through politics. He meant through fear, through loyalty, through power so absolute that people wouldn't question how he got there, only what he would do next. His mother hoped he'd become a lawyer. He did spend some time studying political science and economics at the Universidad Autónoma Latinoamericana. But it wasn't books that captured him, it was control. While students debated theories of justice, Pablo was already rewriting the rules outside the classroom. His education didn't come from professors. It came from traffickers, thieves, and the streets that swallowed men whole. The first time he held a gun, he didn't flinch. He said it felt like holding the future. Cold, heavy, and full of decisions. The power to take, to protect, to destroy. It wasn't about killing. It was about knowing he could. Medellin's poor neighborhoods were breeding grounds for survivalists. Kids grew up fast, and they grew up hungry. Pablo wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but he was always 2 moves ahead. He understood loyalty the way a general understands soldiers. It's earned through fear or favor. He began handing out favors. Small ones at first, paying a neighbor's rent, buying groceries for a struggling family. It wasn't charity. It was investment. Soon, his name began to travel. Not in headlines. In whispers. That Escobar kid, he's not like the others. He had a presence, calm, measured, but always circling something darker. Something you didn't want to see come out. By 18, he was hijacking trucks full of electronics and cigarettes. Sometimes he'd sell the goods himself. Other times, he'd flip them to bigger players. The profits were steady, but not enough. Pablo wanted more. And when cocaine started trickling out of Peru and Bolivia into Colombia, he saw what no one else saw. He saw gold in powder form. The older men laughed at the idea of moving cocaine internationally. Too risky, they said. Too small time. But Pablo wasn't thinking about a few dollars. He was thinking about empires. He understood that Americans would pay anything for something they couldn't get, and that border patrols could be bribed, that pilots could be bought, that drug mules could be made from desperate men and pretty women. He studied everything: routes, airfields, police response times, customs protocols. Cocaine, to him, wasn't a drug. It was a product. And like any good product, it needed supply, demand, and distribution. He had the vision. He just needed the muscle. That's when he met the men who would later become the pillars of the Medellin cartel. Ruthless, ambitious, and just as hungry. Together, they began carving out territory, first in the shadows, then in broad daylight. Pablo used bribes like a painter uses color, strategically, vividly, and with purpose. He didn't throw money. He placed it. And when bribes didn't work, bullets did. But this was still the beginning. Before the billions. Before the bloodbaths. Before the bombings and betrayals. Back then, he was still just a man trying to outrun his past. The son of a farmer. The boy who hated being overlooked. The teenager who stared out at the Medellin skyline at night and whispered, "It will all belong to me." Some nights, he'd drive to the edge of the hills and park in silence, looking out at the sleeping city, imagining it under his control. The buildings, the banks, the people. He wasn't interested in fame. Fame was fleeting. He wanted history. He wanted to rewrite what it meant to be powerful in a country where the rich were born into it, and the poor were expected to stay in their place. Pablo Escobar had no intention of staying in his place. And yet, in those early days, there were still moments of doubt. Moments when his mother's voice would echo in his mind, telling him he was meant for more, just not this way. That there was still a choice. That he could build something clean, something real. But choice is a strange thing. It's easy to see in hindsight. Harder to recognize when it comes disguised as a pile of money or a whispered promise in the dark. By his early 20s, Pablo had already learned to live between 2 worlds. 1 foot in the church pew, 1 foot in the grave. He could pray with his family in the morning, then hijack a shipment by nightfall. He could kiss his mother's cheek, then order a beating on the way out the door. He'd become 2 men, one made of charm, the other made of shadows. What no one knew, not yet, was how quickly the shadow would consume the rest. And just beyond the hills of Medellin, in a jungle clearing near a dusty airstrip, something was happening. A test flight. A small twin-engine plane loaded with powder. Bound for Miami. No one there knew Pablo Escobar's name. But they would. They all would. Chapter 2. Street hustler to smuggler. Building the criminal mindset. The car rolled through the darkened alley, headlights off. In the back seat sat a boy barely in his 20s, his hand steady on a loaded pistol, his eyes locked forward. He wasn't scared. He was calculating. In 10 minutes, he'd walk away with a stolen truck full of imported electronics. In 10 years, he'd own fleets of planes carrying billions of dollars in cocaine. But here, in the narrow veins of Medellin's underworld, Pablo Escobar was still learning how to bleed the system. He wasn't the biggest thief in the city, not yet, but what separated him from the rest wasn't skill. It was vision. While others chased quick money, he was already mapping out empires. Petty crime was his classroom. Every job, a lesson. Every betrayal, a warning. He watched how money moved, how fear opened doors, how loyalty could be bought or destroyed. And as he built his small-time crew, he was quietly gathering the tools he'd one day use to bend a nation to his will. In the early 1970s, Colombia was a smuggler's paradise. Border patrols were thin. Law enforcement was underpaid and overwhelmed. The streets were filled with black market cigarettes, fake lottery tickets, stolen appliances, and hot cars. And Pablo knew how to move it all. He started with the simplest hustle, flipping contraband. Cigarettes from Panama, televisions from Venezuela. He'd bribe a guard here, threaten a shopkeeper there, and make a few hundred pesos stretch into thousands. It wasn't glamorous. It was groundwork. He bought his first car at 20, a beat-up Renault that he rebuilt himself, piece by piece, from stolen parts. He didn't love the car. He loved what it represented. Independence. Control. A symbol that he wasn't waiting for opportunity. He was building it with his bare hands. In that car, he delivered smuggled goods, scoped out targets, and quietly laid the bricks of something bigger. But every step forward required shedding something. Morality. Restraint. The illusion of limits. One night, a rival crew intercepted a shipment Pablo had arranged. It was a warning, stay in your lane. Most young men would have backed down. Pablo didn't. He found out who gave the order, followed the man for 3 days, and left him beaten in a ditch with a shattered knee. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reputation. In the underworld, respect doesn't come from how much you steal. It comes from how far you'll go to protect what's yours. Word began to spread. That Escobar kid didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He was calm, methodical, and dangerous. The kind of man who smiled while calculating how to ruin you. And yet, he still wore the mask of the humble son. At home, he brought flowers to his mother, helped neighbors carry groceries, donated to the local church. But beneath it all, the streets were changing him, layer by layer, brick by bloody brick. He started hijacking cars, not for joyrides, for profit. He'd steal a vehicle, change the plates, alter the registration, and resell it within hours. If the owner made too much noise, Pablo paid someone to convince them to forget. Sometimes with cash, sometimes with a crowbar. Then came the trucks. Bigger payloads, bigger risks. He'd study routes, bribe drivers, intercept convoys, and move the stolen goods to black market warehouses before sunrise. With every job, his network expanded. More eyes, more mouths to feed, more lies to protect. But something about it felt too small. In the bars of Medellin, whispers had started about a new kind of product. White, potent, profitable beyond anything anyone had ever seen. Cocaine. At first, it moved quietly. A few grams here, a few kilos there. But Pablo listened. He knew opportunity when it knocked, even if it wore a gun on its hip and smiled like a devil. Cocaine wasn't just another product. It was a revolution. A pound of the powder could be made for a few $100s in the Andes and sold for thousands in Miami. And it was small, easy to hide, easy to fly, easy to move. Pablo's mind raced with the possibilities. If contraband was a river, cocaine was a flood. And he wanted to build the dam. But stepping into the world of cocaine wasn't like stealing cars. It meant dealing with chemists, growers, pilots, corrupt border agents. It meant learning the science of alkaloids, the mechanics of planes, and the psychology of addiction. He studied it all. He met with jungle chemists in hidden labs, watched how coca leaves were crushed, soaked, cooked into paste, and refined into powder. It smelled like gasoline and ambition. He partnered with small-time traffickers, offering to handle logistics, airfields, storage, movement. His first runs were modest, just a few kilos stuffed into the lining of suitcases or hidden in shipments of produce. But the profits dwarfed anything he'd made before. In weeks, he was earning more than most Colombians made in years. He used the cash to buy silence. Police captains, customs agents, Politicians. For those who wouldn't take a bribe, there was always another option. Plata o plomo. Silver or lead. It was a phrase that would become infamous. A question with only two answers. Take the money or take a bullet. Pablo didn't invent the tactic, but he perfected it. It became his signature, as recognizable as his mustache or the way he wore his collar open at the neck. And it worked. Soon, he wasn't just a smuggler. He was a gatekeeper, a facilitator, a problem solver. Need a corrupt customs officer? He had three. Need a jungle airstrip protected from the army? He'd pay the locals to form a human wall. Pablo didn't move like a thug. He moved like a chess master. Always 3 moves ahead. Always willing to sacrifice a pawn to protect the king. He began surrounding himself with men who were loyal not just to him, but to the idea of him. The myth was already forming. The street kid who outsmarted the police. The smuggler who gave to the poor. The man who could make or break you with a single word. But myths come at a price. One night, after a successful shipment landed in Miami, one of his pilots celebrated too loudly. Got drunk. Told the wrong person too much. Days later, the pilot was found floating in the Magdalena River, wrists bound with wire. No one ever proved who did it. No one needed to. Pablo had crossed into a new world. There was no going back. By the mid-70s, the cocaine trade was exploding. Demand in the United States was insatiable. Wealthy Americans snorted it at parties. Musicians wrote songs about it. Wall Street brokers used it to stay awake during 80-hour weeks. Cocaine had gone from shadowy vice to social status. And Pablo Escobar was riding the wave. But behind the money was pressure. The American DEA was waking up. Colombian police were under international scrutiny. Smuggling routes were getting tighter. Every flight risked seizure. Every deal risked betrayal. Pablo didn't blink. He adapted. Bought more planes. Built more airstrips. Developed new hiding techniques. False bottoms in shipping containers. Drugs sewn into clothing. Even liquefied cocaine hidden in wine bottles. He wasn't just moving product. He was building infrastructure. Still, the profits weren't enough. The margins were good, but Pablo didn't want margins. He wanted control. Total, vertical control. From the leaf to the nose. So he did what no one else had dared. He began buying the farms, the labs, and the routes. He wanted to own the supply chain. To turn a scattered operation into an empire. And he almost did. But empires come with enemies. And Pablo was beginning to attract attention. Not just from the police. From other traffickers. Men who didn't like how fast he was moving. How much he was taking. How willing he was to kill. One night, his mother called him home. She'd heard something. A rumor. A warning. She didn't ask questions, just begged him to stop. This path, she said softly, only ends in blood. Pablo smiled, kissed her forehead, and walked back into the dark. He couldn't stop. Not now. He was too close. Somewhere deep in the jungle, hidden under layers of thick canopy and guarded by men with rifles, construction had begun. A lab. A massive one. Bigger than anything before. Designed to produce metric tons of cocaine. Efficient. Scalable. Ruthless. It would change everything. And Pablo Escobar was ready to go all in. Chapter 3. White Gold, Discovering Cocaine. The first time he saw it cooked into fine white powder, Pablo Escobar said it looked like snow from a place that had never known cold. It was soft, delicate, deceptive, and deadly. The chemist dipped his pinky into the bowl, rubbed the powder against his gums, and smiled. This, he said, is the future. In the dense Colombian jungle, sunlight barely pierced the thick canopy. Inside a primitive lab, made from wood and tarpaulin, 4 men stood surrounded by barrels of chemicals and the sour stench of gasoline. Outside, guards with rifles paced in silence. It was the early 1970s. Cocaine was still a rumor in most of the world. But in that moment, Pablo saw it for what it truly was. Not just a drug. Not just a business. It was a gold rush. Except this gold could fit in your pocket and fly across borders without making a sound. He didn't smile. He rarely did. He just nodded, took one last look at the finished product, and walked out of the lab. His boots sank slightly into the damp soil as he lit a cigarette. In his mind, a map was already forming. Routes, contacts, storage, distribution. A new empire. One measured not in acres or soldiers, but in grams and kilos. In the United States, cocaine had begun its quiet infiltration. At upscale parties in Manhattan and Los Angeles, it was passed discreetly on mirrors and dollar bills. Rich kids and record producers saw it as a luxury, a cleaner high than heroin, a more elegant buzz than weed. But in Colombia, it was still just a whisper. The cartels hadn't formed yet. The big money hadn't arrived. There were only whispers, chemists, and risk-takers. Pablo was ready to take the risk. He started small. A few kilos moved out of labs in Peru and Bolivia, trucked overland to Colombia's borders, and flown north by trusted pilots. He knew the jungle better than the military did, knew which valleys hid radar-proof flight paths, which rivers could carry men and fuel unnoticed. He didn't need to invent anything. He just had to organize what was already there. Cocaine was the product. He would become the system. Back in Medellin, he set up meetings, not with politicians or police, not yet, but with other smugglers, bootleggers, and middlemen. Men who had ambition but no structure. He offered them something rare, coordination. A seat at a table that hadn't existed before. Pablo wasn't asking to be followed. He was offering them a future. Safer routes, better profits, shared protection. Most of them said yes. A few didn't. Their names were forgotten quickly. From those early handshakes, the Medellin cartel was born. Not with a signature or a logo, but with a silent agreement. We move together, or we die alone. The operation spread like wildfire. They paid off rural farmers to grow coca leaves by the ton, hired chemists to process the leaves into base paste, then refine it into powder, built secret labs so remote that government forces couldn't even locate them, let alone raid them. Everything moved fast, like watching a skeleton form from fog. What was vague and scattered began to harden into shape, and Pablo was always at the center. He handled logistics like a general commanding an invisible army. He bought planes from the U.S., bribed mechanics to rig extra fuel tanks, and paid pilots triple their weight in gold to fly the deadly cargo. Each successful run brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that money was reinvested with surgical precision. Safe houses were bought in key cities. Lawyers were placed on retainer. Entire neighborhoods were paid off with food, medicine, and cash. He became both savior and shadow. When children saw his car pull up, they ran beside it cheering. When journalists wrote about him, they called him a ghost. But even ghosts leave a trace. The cocaine business was different from anything Pablo had touched before. Stolen cars and cigarettes were fast cash. Cocaine was power. Each kilo was like printing your own currency. He started doing the math. 1 kilo bought for under $1,000 in Colombia could sell for over 50 times that in Miami or New York. Multiplied by the hundreds, by the thousands, it was dizzying. Within a year, his operations moved from dozens of kilos to hundreds, then thousands. And the more he made, the less he trusted. Every link in the chain was a liability. A pilot who got drunk. A guard who took a second bribe. A cook who skimmed too much off the top. Pablo began implementing his own code. Strict, ruthless, and final. Mistakes were punished. Disloyalty was erased. His message was clear: I can make you rich. I can also make you disappear. He wasn't just creating a cartel. He was creating a myth. The name Medellin began to mean something more than a city. It became synonymous with fear, luxury, violence, and control. And Escobar? He became legend. People who had never met him spoke of his generosity, of how he paid for children's surgeries, built soccer fields, fed entire neighborhoods. But those same streets also knew silence, knew the sound of tires rolling slowly in the night, knew that crossing him was a mistake you only made once. He wore power like a tailored suit, quiet, precise, dangerous. At meetings, he rarely raised his voice. He didn't have to. He'd listen more than he spoke, let others feel bold, then decide their fate with a glance. He rewarded loyalty lavishly. Homes, cars, women. But the moment someone faltered, they vanished. In the U.S., authorities began noticing the influx. Seizures at airports. Sudden overdoses. New names whispered in DEA briefings. But no one knew who Escobar was, not yet. He kept his name off shipping manifests, never used phones, and trusted only family and blood-sworn allies. He moved like smoke. There, then gone. Back in the jungle, the labs expanded. From wooden huts to industrial-scale facilities with generators, guards, and supply chains. The product improved. Purity rose. And so did the demand. Cocaine had become the drug of the decade. Movie stars, executives, even politicians, everyone wanted it. And Pablo was their silent supplier. The Medellin cartel now moved product through multiple countries. Brazil, Panama, the Bahamas, Mexico. Each route protected by bribes and bullets. Each operation refined, calculated, lethal. And with every load that landed in the U.S., Escobar's fortune grew. By the late 70s, he was making tens of millions per month. And no one, not even him, could track it all. Money began to overflow. Literally. He had so much cash, he couldn't launder it fast enough. He started buying real estate by the block. Farms, apartments, warehouses, anything that could soak up money without raising suspicion. But even that wasn't enough. So he buried it. In fields, under houses, inside walls. Millions lost to rot, rats, and rain. He didn't care. There was always more. He hired entire teams just to count cash, and others to protect it. At his peak, he was spending over $2,000 a month on rubber bands alone, just to hold the stacks together. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about control. The kind of control that turns laws into suggestions and governments into puppets. Still, the success brought shadows. Other traffickers watched him rise. Some admired him. Others feared him. A few hated him. Jealousy started to bubble. Rivalries formed. Pablo knew it was coming. You don't get to the top without making enemies. And you don't stay there by being merciful. So he planned. Built walls. Dug escape tunnels. Planted informants. He treated every partner like a potential threat. Even his closest allies were never completely trusted. In the world he was building, paranoia wasn't weakness. It was survival. He returned home less often. Spoke less. Slept with one eye open. And yet, the legend kept growing. Kids named their dogs after him. Poor families prayed for him. In the barrios, he was more than a man. He was a myth wrapped in flesh. And still, it wasn't enough. There were whispers now, not from the shadows, but from the centers of power. Politicians discussing laws that could change everything. Laws that allowed extradition. If passed, they would give the United States the right to drag Colombian nationals across borders to face trial. To Pablo Escobar, that wasn't justice. It was betrayal. He saw what was coming. War. Not on the streets. In the courts. In backrooms. In embassies. The Americans were circling. Colombia was cracking under pressure. And Pablo Escobar wasn't going to wait for the walls to close in. He was going to build his own. And make sure no one ever climbed over them. But just as the white gold turned him into a king, it also painted a target on his back. Chapter 4. The Rise of the Cartel, Power, Blood, and Profit. The meeting took place in a dusty hacienda deep in the Colombian countryside. The air was still, the silence sharp. A dozen men sat at a long table, cigarette smoke hanging like mist, pistol grips poking from jacket linings, and eyes filled with suspicion. But there was no shouting, no raised voices, just numbers, routes, and the quiet hum of empire being born. Pablo Escobar didn't speak until the very end. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low but steady. We don't need to fight each other. There's enough cocaine in these hills to make gods out of all of us. No one disagreed. Because everyone in that room understood one thing. Whoever controlled Colombia's cocaine trade was no longer a criminal. They were a king. The Medellin cartel wasn't founded on a single day. It was born from necessity. Out of the blood-soaked chaos of small-time traffickers realizing that division meant death, and unity meant domination. Pablo was already a rising power, but he wasn't alone. He needed allies, and he found them in men just as ambitious, just as ruthless. Carlos Letter was wild energy incarnate. Half Colombian, half German, obsessed with both cocaine and Adolf Hitler, he brought a twisted charisma and logistical genius. Where Pablo preferred silence, Letter was a firebrand. But he knew how to move product. He found an island in the Bahamas, Norman's Cay, and turned it into a launch pad for cocaine flights into Florida. It became a pipeline, a literal highway in the sky, protected by radar blind spots, bribed officials, and bullets when needed. Then there were the Ochoa brothers, Jorge, Fabio, and Juan David. Wealthy cattle ranchers with deep pockets, polished manners, and political connections that ran through the veins of Colombian society. They weren't street thugs. They were businessmen, dressed in linen and gold watches, who understood that cocaine wasn't just a drug. It was an export, a product, a billion-dollar industry waiting to be seized. Together, they formed a new kind of organization, structured like a corporation, protected like a militia, and fed by the world's insatiable hunger for white powder. Each man brought something to the table. Letter, the planes and transport routes. The Ochoas, the money and respectability. Pablo, the muscle, the vision, the absolute will to do whatever it took. Within months, the cartel controlled nearly every step of the supply chain, from coca farms in Peru and Bolivia, to jungle labs in Colombia, to airstrips in the Bahamas, and finally to the neon-lit streets of Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. It was industrial-scale drug trafficking, and it was happening beneath the noses of governments too slow, too corrupt, or too afraid to stop it. They didn't see themselves as criminals. Not entirely. They were entrepreneurs in a lawless market, taking what others were too timid to reach for. But with profit came paranoia, and with power came blood. As their shipments grew, by the hundreds, then thousands of kilos, so did their enemies. Rivals in Cali, traitors within, American DEA agents circling like vultures. So they built defenses. Not just armed guards and bunkers, but networks of bribery that stretched from Medellin to Washington. Judges were bought, police chiefs silenced. Even presidents began to look the other way, their pockets lined with cartel money. The cartel paid its foot soldiers more than the military. A street kid with nothing could make a fortune running errands for Escobar. Drive a truck, guard a stash, pull a trigger. Loyalty was rewarded. Disobedience was buried. In Medellin, Pablo became a god. He built homes for the poor, sponsored football teams, paid for schools, clinics, and churches. Mothers cried when they met him. Fathers shook his hand like he was a savior. But underneath the generosity was a message: I protect you. Worship me. And in return, I own this city. The Ochoas built sprawling ranches guarded like fortresses. Let her turn Norman's Cay into a cocaine Disneyland. Runways, mansions, speedboats, and military-grade security. Planes landed daily, loaded with product, refueled, and disappeared into the night sky toward Miami. Each trip brought back millions. And the Americans? They were still trying to figure out where the fire was while the forest burned. Back in Colombia, the cartel operated with surgical precision. Couriers were trained to swallow pellets of cocaine, their stomachs turned into ticking bombs of profit and risk. Cargo containers were double-lined. Fuel tanks were hollowed out. Even dolls and children's toys were used to hide product. If it could fit cocaine, it was used. And when things went wrong, when a shipment was seized or an informant talked, retribution was swift. Entire families vanished. Bodies were hung from overpasses. Warnings were carved into skin. Pablo didn't believe in second chances. He believed in lessons. Still, the cartel wasn't invincible. In the late 1970s, U.S. authorities began connecting dots. The DEA, under growing pressure, started hunting the sources. Not the street dealers, but the suppliers. They traced flights back to Colombia, found airstrips carved into jungle clearings, spotted patterns in wire transfers and luxury purchases. But the Medellin cartel was always one step ahead. They had insiders everywhere. Bankers, airport staff, even low-level diplomats. Every investigation seemed to hit a wall or a coffin. Then, one of Letter's pilots was arrested. He talked, gave up Norman's Cay. The DEA raided the island. Planes were seized. Millions lost. Letter went underground, furious and paranoid. Pablo watched it all with quiet intensity. He hadn't built his operation on islands or noise. He built it on silence, strategy, and fear. Letter's recklessness was a crack in the cartel's armor. He knew what had to be done. Pablo began tightening control, standardizing shipments, rotating routes, replacing loud partners with quieter, more obedient men. The cartel had to evolve or die. So it did. By the early 1980s, they weren't just dominating the cocaine market. They were rewriting it. Smuggling became an art form. Bribery a science. The Medellin cartel controlled over 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. They made more money than most Fortune 500 companies. And Pablo Escobar? He was making over $1 million a day. But with every dollar, the stakes climbed higher. Governments that once turned a blind eye began to feel the pressure. The United States demanded action. Colombia passed stricter laws. Talk of extradition grew louder. The walls were closing in. Inside the cartel, tensions rose. Some partners wanted to lay low. Others, like Pablo, wanted to push harder, to expand, to silence anyone who got in the way. The Ochoas worried about the growing violence. Letter, hiding from law enforcement, became increasingly erratic. The alliance that once felt unbreakable now had fractures. Pablo saw it, but didn't flinch. He believed in power through fear, in silencing threats before they became problems. When a judge ruled against one of his men, she was assassinated in broad daylight. When a newspaper printed an expose, its editor was found dead. He wasn't just fighting rivals. He was sending a message to the entire country: cross me, and you die. Still, the public loved him. In Medellin, he built entire neighborhoods for the poor, delivered groceries to widows, paid for surgeries, schools, and soccer stadiums. His face appeared in murals. His name was whispered like a prayer. He was the Robin Hood of Colombia. But even Robin Hood, if given too much power, becomes the king. And kings attract challengers. The Cali cartel, once small-time rivals, were growing in the shadows. Smarter, quieter, and more politically connected, they watched Medellin's reign with envy. And soon, the war between cartels would turn Colombia into a battlefield. But for now, in the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar stood at the peak of his empire. A man who turned powder into power, who rose from the slums to build a network so vast, so rich, and so lethal that even world governments feared his name. Yet behind his calm eyes was something darker, a growing need for more. Not just money, but control, respect, immortality. And somewhere in a smoke-filled room in Bogotá, a government official signed the first order. A name, a file, a photo. Pablo Escobar. They were coming for him, and he was ready. Chapter 5. The Cocaine Superhighway, Smuggling into the U.S. The plane skimmed just above the treetops, its wings slicing through the damp jungle air. Below, a narrow dirt runway waited like a scar across the green, lit by oil drums on fire. The pilot had no lights, no radar, and no room for error. But his cargo was worth more than gold. 500 kilos of cocaine, wrapped tight, packed like bricks of fortune. If he landed, he'd be a hero. If he crashed, he'd be a ghost. This was the new front line. Not of guns, but of logistics. Not of ideology, but of profit. Pablo Escobar didn't just build a drug empire. He engineered a cocaine superhighway stretching from the valleys of Colombia to the clubs of Miami. And every mile of it was paved with corruption, blood, and brilliance. The route was everything. If you couldn't move the product, you were nothing. Pablo understood this better than anyone. His genius wasn't just in violence. It was in transportation. In creating a system so fast, so vast, and so protected that cocaine flowed like water while the world tried to plug holes with bare hands. It started with the coca fields in the Andes. Poor farmers, campesinos, grew the leaves under the watchful eye of cartel enforcers. The plants were harvested, crushed, and cooked into base paste in jungle labs that smelled like diesel and sweat. That paste was then refined into cocaine hydrochloride, a pure, white powder ready for export. Getting it out of Colombia, however, was the art. Pablo used everything. Small planes, fishing boats, trucks with hidden compartments, mules who swallowed rubber pellets filled with powder, even hollowed-out religious statues. But none of it was random. Every move was calculated. Every route tested, mapped, and rehearsed like a military operation. In the early days, The main route ran through the Bahamas. Tiny islands like Norman's Cay became critical. Pablo and his partners, like Carlos Letter, turned these islands into cocaine hubs, mini airports, complete with refueling stations, radar maps, and gunmen guarding every inch. From there, planes could leapfrog into southern Florida, landing on clandestine strips or dropping the product into the ocean, where speedboats retrieved it before Coast Guards even noticed. The pilots were cartel royalty. Former military, often American, paid tens of thousands per trip. They flew at night, just above radar. Sometimes they killed their lights mid-flight. Sometimes they landed in cow pastures in Alabama or remote airfields in Texas. And every time they returned, they were treated like war heroes, with cash, women, and silence. Then there were the submarines. Not military grade, but homemade. Low-profile vessels designed to sit just below the surface, invisible to satellites, nearly undetectable to sonar. Built in jungle workshops, tested in swamps, crewed by desperate men who knew that one leak meant death. These subs moved slowly but surely, along river deltas, into coastal waters, slipping beneath patrols and docking at isolated points in Central America or Mexico. From there, trucks took over, specially modified with false bottoms, sealed compartments, and decoy cargo. Each driver trained not just to drive, but to lie, to bluff at checkpoints, to memorize cover stories. They were the veins of the operation, and Pablo pumped product through them nonstop. Sometimes, the cocaine arrived sewn into clothing. Other times, liquefied into shampoo bottles. The cartel even experimented with embedding it into plastic, molding it into furniture, then chemically extracting it once it arrived in the U.S. Every idea was tested. Every weakness in border security exploited. It was innovation at its darkest. And then came the mules. Men, women, even children, paid a few $100s to swallow balloons filled with powder. Each balloon no larger than a thumb. Dozens swallowed in one sitting. A single tear or rupture meant instant death. Airports became silent stages of agony. Passengers pacing, sweating, praying the customs dogs wouldn't catch a whiff of their deadly secret. The cartel paid well, but it paid in silence. Mules who talked didn't live long. Those who delivered were often rewarded, but never too much. Pablo wanted loyalty, not greed. And above all, he wanted obedience. As the product reached Miami, the streets began to shift. Cocaine wasn't just a drug. It was a cultural shift. It filled nightclubs and boardrooms, built mansions, funded record labels. The city pulsed with white powder and fast money. Murders skyrocketed. Police departments swelled. But the supply never stopped. Every seizure made the headlines. Every bust was framed as a victory. But for every ton caught, 3 got through. The DEA was playing defense on a field Pablo had designed. He anticipated their moves before they made them, bribed their informants, turned their agents, built fake supply routes as bait, while the real product slipped through unnoticed. It became a war of shadows. In Colombia, airstrips were carved into banana plantations, masked as farmland. Communications were coded. Couriers used dead drops and burner phones. Some shipments had decoys, a van filled with cocaine deliberately intercepted to distract from a truck rolling quietly across another checkpoint. When American pressure intensified, Pablo adapted. He shifted routes through Panama, through Honduras, through corrupt officials in Mexico who took their cut and asked no questions. He diversified the flow, turning his empire into a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 more appeared. Each successful run made him bolder. He started sending larger shipments. Planes carrying over 1,000 kilos. Ships carrying entire containers. Even entire cargo companies were built from scratch, legitimate on paper, but in reality, conveyor belts for poison. The sheer scale was staggering. By the mid-1980s, Pablo was responsible for over 80% of the world's cocaine supply. And yet, no one could stop it. The U.S. increased funding, trained Colombian anti-narcotics units, sent radar-equipped planes and surveillance satellites. But Pablo's routes evolved faster than their response. It was like fighting a virus that mutated on contact. For Pablo, logistics was more than movement, it was warfare. He studied his enemies. found their weaknesses, exploited bureaucracy like a scalpel. He didn't need to outgun the Americans. He just needed to outthink them. He once joked that his biggest problem wasn't the DEA, it was rats. Literal rats. Chewing through cash stored in damp warehouses. He lost millions to rot, to mold, to hungry rodents. And he didn't care. Because what mattered wasn't the money. It was the control. Control of flow. Of fear. Of the very concept of borders. In Miami, prosecutors built cases. Task forces formed. Informants were flipped. But none of it touched Pablo directly. He never used his name. Never signed a paper. Never visited a shipment site. He was everywhere and nowhere. And still, the violence grew. Smuggling routes weren't just channels, they were battlefields. Rival gangs fought for control. Murders spiked along every corridor. From Cali to Caracas, from Panama City to El Paso, bodies dropped as warnings. And Pablo, always watching, adjusted accordingly. If a route got too hot, he shut it down. If a pilot got greedy, he vanished. If a customs officer got bold, his family received a visit. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. Still the law of the land. As the money flowed in, Pablo reinvested. Not just in infrastructure, but in people. He paid villagers to guard airstrips. Gave scholarships to the children of mules. Built soccer fields in towns where his planes refueled. Every kindness was a contract. Every favor, a leash. And through it all, the superhighway expanded. New air corridors over Venezuela. New shipping routes through West Africa. New smuggling techniques using commercial flights, fake ambulances, diplomatic pouches. Every law had a loophole. Every wall, a door. It was too big to stop. And yet, even Pablo knew it couldn't last forever. The Americans were adapting. Wiretaps. Satellites. Joint task forces. Cartel insiders were starting to talk. The cocaine superhighway wasn't invisible anymore. It was lit up like a runway. Every mile now watched, every phone call recorded. But Pablo didn't slow down. He doubled down, built bigger labs, ordered more planes, created fake passports by the hundreds. And in the shadows, he began to prepare for the next phase. Not just smuggling drugs, but reshaping the nation that made it possible. He would no longer just move through Colombia. He would rule it. And somewhere, on a cracked airstrip in the jungle, a plane roared to life. Another run, another shipment, another silent act in a war no one was ready to end. Chapter 6. The Empire of Medellin, Cash, Chaos, and Control. The gates to Hacienda Napoles didn't open, they announced themselves. A replica of a small plane sat mounted above the entrance arch, its white body weathered by sun and rain. It was the first aircraft Pablo ever used to smuggle cocaine into the United States. Now, it was a trophy, bold, unapologetic, defiant. Behind the gates stretched over 5,000 acres of manicured chaos, where giraffes roamed alongside luxury cars and flamingos shared ponds with black swans. This wasn't just a home. It was a monument to wealth soaked in blood, a living museum of untouchable power. At the center of it all stood Pablo Escobar, short, mustachioed, dressed modestly, but commanding a fortune that dwarfed most world leaders. By the mid-1980s, Forbes listed him among the richest men on earth. But the numbers were meaningless. The truth was untrackable. When you made tens of millions a day, money stopped being a goal. It became a burden, a threat, a fire that had to be buried to keep from burning down the empire. So he buried it, literally. Across Colombia, fields were dug at night. Barns, basements, even jungles were turned into treasure vaults. Plastic drums stuffed with American dollars sealed in vacuum wrap, layered with tar, and buried deep beneath the ground. Some were marked with GPS coordinates. Others left to fate. Millions lost to mold, rats, or memory. Pablo didn't blink. He called it the cost of doing business. But even in loss, he still had too much. He built homes for every family member, bought entire neighborhoods, paid accountants just to count cash, an impossible task that required scales instead of calculators. Rubber bands became a monthly expense in the thousands. Storage rooms needed guards. Walls needed reinforcement. And none of it slowed him down. At Hacienda Napoles, he created his own kingdom. The estate included a private zoo with elephants, zebras, ostriches, and the now infamous hippos that would later breed and roam wild long after he was gone. There were vintage cars, helicopters, a bull ring, a go-kart track, and a private landing strip that cut through palm trees like a scar. Guests would arrive for parties where champagne flowed like tap water and American pop music echoed through the hills. Politicians, celebrities, beauty queens, traffickers, and priests, anyone who could be bought or controlled, sat at his tables. They smiled, toasted, laughed. But behind the eyes was always the same question. What happens if he turns? Because the money didn't just buy luxury. It bought obedience. Entire police departments were on his payroll. Judges, airport officials, soldiers. He could make a phone call and have a man released from prison or sent to a grave. Power wasn't just something he had. It was something he wore like a second skin. But with that power came a new kind of danger, ego. Pablo began believing in his myth. He walked through Medellin like a messiah, tossing bills to children, funding soccer fields and housing projects, kneeling to pray in front of crowds that chanted his name. And the city loved him for it. To the poor, he was hope. To the desperate, he was justice. But to the government, he was a virus infecting the country's soul. He once burned $2 million in cash just to keep his daughter warm during a night in hiding. Not because it was dramatic, but because it meant nothing to him. Money had become paper. Control was the only currency that mattered. Still, the world was watching. The United States increased pressure. The Colombian elite grew uneasy. The Medellin cartel was too visible, too loud, too deadly. And Pablo, instead of retreating, grew bolder. He wore tailored suits to funerals of men he'd ordered killed. He smiled in courtrooms. He gave interviews denying everything while sitting beneath chandeliers purchased with drug money. But inside, there were cracks forming. Some of his closest allies began to whisper. The Ochoas were worried about exposure. Letter had gone into hiding. The Cali cartel, once a nuisance, was rising fast. Pablo didn't trust anyone anymore. He began cycling through bodyguards, moved constantly, spoke less, smiled less. His empire, for all its glittering glory, was becoming a gilded cage. And in that cage, he became more dangerous. Anyone who crossed him disappeared. Journalists, judges, ministers. A car bomb here. A bullet there. He didn't sign death orders. He simply nodded. His men understood. His enemies were erased with clinical precision. Medellin became a city of whispered warnings and invisible lines. Even his kindness had fangs. A gift from Escobar was never free. It came with strings, political favors, silence, allegiance. If you accepted his help, you belonged to him. If you refused, you'd better start praying. And yet, to the barrios, he remained a saint. He built entire neighborhoods, complete with running water, electricity, and schools. He paid for surgeries, education, and weddings. Mothers named their sons after him. Graffiti bore his initials. For the poor, he wasn't a criminal. He was salvation. A man who gave when the government ignored, who protected when the state abandoned. But Pablo didn't just want to be loved. He wanted to be remembered. He commissioned murals, statues, posed for photos with priests and orphans. He wanted to rewrite history in real time, where his name would stand beside revolutionaries, not traffickers, where future generations would read about the Robin Hood of Medellin, not the king of cocaine. Yet for all the wealth, all the noise, there was always silence behind the gates. At Hacienda Napoles, the nights grew longer. Security doubled. Guards paced rooftops with rifles and radios. Dogs barked at shadows. And Pablo, now rarely alone, sat under the stars with a quiet look in his eyes. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't at peace. He knew the world wouldn't let him hold on to everything forever. The Colombian government had passed the extradition law, allowing traffickers to be sent to the United States for trial. Pablo considered this the ultimate betrayal. To him, Colombian soil was sacred. He would rather die in Medellin than live in a U.S. prison cell. So he began preparing. He funded anti-extradition campaigns, hired lawyers, paid politicians to stall votes. He even offered to pay Colombia's foreign debt in exchange for amnesty. It wasn't charity. It was a chess move. a king trying to protect his crown. And as pressure mounted, his paranoia deepened. He buried more money, moved his family, rerouted his network. He watched allies fall to arrest or assassination and wondered who would be next. He started keeping his son close, slept in a different room each night, ate from separate plates in case of poison. He was still rich, still powerful, but he was no longer untouchable. The empire of Medellin had grown too big, too loud, too bloody. And Pablo Escobar, who once ruled from a throne of cash and chaos, now sat in the shadows of the very kingdom he built, wondering which of his walls would crumble first. Chapter 7. The Robin Hood of Medellin, Public Love versus Private Terror. The sun rose over Medellin, casting a golden glow on the clay rooftops and winding streets of the poorest barrios. Children laughed in the dusty alleys, chasing soccer balls kicked over cracked pavement. Mothers stood in doorways, watching as a caravan of trucks unloaded bags of cement, bricks, and supplies. A new school was being built. A clinic, too. Promises wrapped in concrete and hope. But just beyond the joyful noise, in the shadows of those same streets, silence ruled, a silence carved by fear. This was Pablo Escobar's Medellin, a city split between adoration and terror, between salvation and death. To the poor, he was a savior. To the government and the frightened, he was a monster. He called himself a man of the people, and in many ways, he was. His hands were in every corner of the city, building homes for families who had never had running water, funding football fields where kids dreamed of escape, paying for surgeries that the public hospitals refused to cover. Mothers named their children after him. Streets bore his initials in graffiti. Don Pablo, they whispered, the man who gave what the state never could. Yet, behind the generosity was a ledger written in blood. He bought loyalty with bricks and bullets. The schools he built came with lessons. Speak well of me, never cross me. The clinics saved lives, but only if you pledged silence. His housing projects were sanctuaries for some, traps for others. Accept his kindness, and you were part of his army. Reject it, and you became a target. The line between protector and predator blurred. Escobar's rise wasn't just about cocaine, it was about control. He understood something most criminals ignored. Power didn't only come from violence. It came from hearts and minds, from creating dependency, from making people believe he was their only hope. In Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, his name was sacred. He gave out Christmas gifts in the streets, organized festivals, and even paid for funerals of those killed in the crossfire of his wars. The poor weren't just his customers, they were his subjects. And he was their king. But outside these communities, terror reigned. Behind closed doors, his enforcers executed rivals, traitors, and anyone who threatened his empire. Cars exploded in crowded plazas. Judges found bullets in their mailboxes. Journalists who wrote the truth disappeared without a trace. His message was clear: love me or fear me. Because if you dared to do both, death was the third choice. His motto, plata o plomo, silver or lead, became law. Accept his bribe or face his bullet. There was no middle ground. And the violence wasn't random. It was surgical, calculated to break spirits, silence voices, and send warnings. Entire families vanished overnight. Bodies appeared hanging from bridges, a grim reminder that Escobar's reach was long and unforgiving. The public face and the private terror were two sides of the same coin, spinning faster and faster until the people of Medellin were trapped between hope and horror. Some who lived in his shadow spoke of him as a god, while others whispered his name in fear, careful never to attract attention. His generosity was real, but so was his cruelty. Escobar mastered the art of contradictions. He built churches and then bombed them if priests criticized him. He funded soccer teams and then assassinated players suspected of betrayal. He was a father to his children and a ruthless king to his enemies. And as his empire grew, so did his paranoia. No one was safe, not his closest allies, not his family, not even himself. Trust was a currency he spent sparingly. He moved constantly, slept in different houses, and surrounded himself with armed men. His smile grew rarer, his eyes colder. Yet, his legend only deepened. In the slums, murals of him stood alongside saints. Songs were written about his generosity, and when the government moved to arrest him, protests erupted. To many, he was not a criminal but a hero fighting a corrupt system. But heroes fall, and as the pressure mounted, from police raids, rival cartels, and international law enforcement, the fragile balance between public love and private terror began to crack. Because in the end, a king who rules with bullets as much as with gifts can never be safe. And Medellin would soon learn which side of that coin would decide its fate. Chapter 8. Plata o Plomo, the Philosophy of Fear. The night was thick with tension. A judge sat alone in his home, the faint hum of a radio filling the silence. Outside, shadows shifted. Quiet footsteps pressed close, relentless. A single knock. No time to answer. Then the unmistakable report of a gunshot shattered the stillness. It was a warning, a message carved in violence. Plata o plomo. Silver or lead. Pablo Escobar's chilling mantra wasn't just a phrase. It was a doctrine, a brutal ultimatum offered to everyone who stood between him and his empire. Accept the bribe, the silver, and live in comfort. Refuse, and the lead would find you, swift, cold, and permanent. This was the calculus of fear that ruled Colombia. Judges, police officers, politicians, none were exempt. Each day, they weighed their options against the life they wanted to keep. For some, the silver was impossible to resist. Piles of cash arrived in unmarked cars. Envelopes slipped under doors. Bank accounts swollen beyond imagination. The temptation was a poison slowly seeping into the system, eroding justice and law. But for others, the choice was deadly serious. To say no was to sign your own death warrant. The first assassinations were surgical. A prosecutor here, a police captain there. Targets carefully chosen, public enough to send a message, but not so high profile to ignite an uproar. Bullet holes in government offices, bloodstains on marble floors. Fear spread like wildfire. Inside the government, whispers turned to panic. How do you fight a man who owns the courts, the cops, and the assassins? How do you uphold the law when the law bends beneath the weight of a bullet? Pablo's network was vast and deep. Informants hidden in every agency. Officers paid to turn their heads. Politicians bought to block extradition laws. The silver wasn't just money. It was protection, a shield woven from greed and fear. But the lead was never far behind. When bribery failed, violence took its place. Courts were bombed. Judges were gunned down in broad daylight. Police convoys ambushed on mountain roads. Even entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. The lines between war and crime blurred. Colombia became a country under siege, not by armies, but by a drug lord's mercenaries. And the terror was personal. Families of law enforcers were threatened. Children vanished. Homes burned. The message was clear. This was not just about business. It was about control. To Pablo, fear was a weapon more powerful than money. It was the key to obedience, silence, and domination. Plata o plomo was the shadow hanging over every decision, every conversation. It turned friends into enemies, neighbors into informants, and cities into prisons. Some who took the silver lived haunted lives, knowing that their loyalty was bought with blood and that the price of betrayal was death. Others who refused became martyrs, their names etched in the memory of a country struggling to breathe beneath the cartel's iron fist. As the war escalated, Escobar's grip tightened. He didn't just eliminate opponents, he obliterated hope. Public spaces became graveyards. Institutions crumbled, and the rule of law became a whispered legend. Yet, despite the violence, some still believed in his promise. That the silver was real, that protection could be bought, that fear could be managed. But fear is a double-edged sword. And as Colombia stood on the brink of chaos, the question loomed. How long could a kingdom built on plata o plomo endure before it shattered under its own weight? Chapter 9. Politics and Power. Escobar enters Congress. The Grand Hall was packed, eyes fixed on a modest man stepping to the microphone. The air was thick with expectation and suspicion. This was no ordinary politician. This was a man who had built an empire in the shadows, and now he was stepping into the light. Pablo Escobar's entrance into Colombian politics was a calculated gamble, a bold move that shocked a nation and changed everything. In the early 1980s, the lines between crime and politics blurred like ink in water. Colombia was a country desperate for stability, but riddled with corruption and fear. Into this chaos stepped a man with a new plan, not just to rule from the shadows, but to claim legitimacy, to wear the badge of power openly. His campaign wasn't built on policy or promises. It was built on loyalty and fear, on handouts to the poor and threats to the rich, on charity to the forgotten and violence against the dissenters. He gave money to neighborhoods abandoned by the government, built soccer fields, schools, and clinics. And in return, he asked only for votes. To many in Medellin's barrios, he was a hero, a benefactor, a man who could cut through decades of neglect and corruption. But to the elite, to the journalists, and to the government, he was a criminal hiding behind a politician's mask. When he won a seat in the Chamber of Representatives, the world took notice. Here was a man who openly flaunted the laws he broke, smiling as he sat among lawmakers sworn to uphold those very laws. His presence was a slap in the face to justice. And yet, he wielded his power with surprising finesse. He used his position not just for immunity, but to advance his agenda. He pushed back against extradition treaties, fiercely opposing any law that would send drug traffickers to American prisons. For him, Colombia was his kingdom, and he would not let foreign powers dictate its fate. But the spotlight brought risks. His enemies, both inside and outside the cartel, saw his political rise as a threat. Journalists began digging, unmasking the truth beneath the facade. Investigators connected the dots between his philanthropy and his blood-soaked business. The veil was lifting, and with exposure came danger. Assassination attempts on political rivals increased. Bombs exploded near government buildings. Fear escalated to chaos. The fragile democracy trembled under the weight of a drug lord's ambition. Pablo's time in Congress was brief but explosive. It shattered illusions and forced the nation to confront a harsh reality. Their government had been infiltrated by a man whose power came not from votes, but from violence and money. His political ascent marked a turning point, a moment when the line between criminal and statesman disappeared, and Colombia's nightmare became undeniable. As the walls closed in, Pablo faced a choice: retreat into the shadows or fight in the open. He chose to fight, and the war for Colombia's soul was just beginning. Chapter 10. Exposed, the government turns on Pablo. The camera's flash illuminated a man smiling confidently, surrounded by supporters. But behind that grin was a man teetering on the edge of a storm that threatened to swallow him whole. His empire, once a carefully guarded secret, was unraveling before the world's eyes. Pablo Escobar's dark side had become too visible. For years, the veil had hidden the brutality beneath the generosity. The piles of cash masked the violence. The mansions obscured the corpses. But as journalists began to dig deeper, cracks appeared in the perfect facade. Investigative reporters risked everything to expose the truth. They uncovered money trails stretching across continents, connections to politicians, and a long list of unsolved murders that led back to him. Front-page stories painted him as the kingpin of a criminal empire, not the beloved benefactor. But the press wasn't alone. Colombia's elite, business leaders, government officials, and rival cartels started to see Escobar as a threat too great to ignore. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a danger to the country's fragile stability. The government, long paralyzed by corruption and fear, began to push back. Task forces were assembled. Military operations planned. Lawmakers passed stricter extradition laws, hoping to send traffickers like him to American prisons. But Escobar was no ordinary target. He responded with violence that shocked the nation. Bombings in city centers, assassinations of judges, politicians, and police officers. Streets became war zones. Civilians caught in the crossfire whispered prayers, unsure if they were living in a city or a battlefield. Each attack was a message: don't cross me. Inside his inner circle, fear grew. Allies wondered if the king was losing his grip. Enforcers whispered about the rising heat from law enforcement and rival factions. Even those who once adored him sensed the tide was turning. Yet, Escobar remained defiant. He continued to fund social programs, rally supporters, and claim innocence in public statements. His charisma was a weapon, convincing many that he was being hunted unfairly, that he was a victim of political conspiracy. But the government's resolve hardened. International pressure mounted. The United States offered support and resources to dismantle the cartel. Surveillance intensified. Wiretaps picked up secret meetings. Informants flipped, exposing inner workings. The net was closing. And in the midst of it all, Escobar faced a stark reality. His world was shrinking, and the war he had ignited was coming home to burn him. As Colombia braced for the inevitable showdown, the question lingered: how far would a man go to protect the empire he built on blood and fear? Chapter 11. The Extradition Crisis, declaring war on Colombia. The roar of explosions ripped through the heart of Bogotá. Glass shattered, flames climbed walls, and terrified screams filled the streets. In the chaos, a grim message was being carved into the city's soul. No one was untouchable. Not politicians, not judges, not even innocent bystanders. The war had arrived. This was the price of a man's greatest fear: extradition. For years, Pablo Escobar had operated with a single, unshakable dread: the thought of being ripped from Colombian soil and sent to a U.S. prison. To him, extradition was the ultimate betrayal. A death sentence in chains, thousands of miles from his empire, his family, and the streets that had made him king. It was a fear that would soon plunge Colombia into an unprecedented crisis, a campaign of terror designed to dismantle the government's resolve and preserve his freedom at any cost. The extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States had long been a point of contention, but in the mid-1980s, pressure from Washington intensified. Lawmakers in Bogotá voted to ratify the treaty, signaling a new era where traffickers could no longer escape justice by hiding beneath national borders. For Pablo, this was a declaration of war. What followed was a calculated, ruthless response. Bombings targeted government buildings, nightclubs, and even civilian areas. Vehicles packed with explosives detonated without warning, turning bustling intersections into scenes of carnage. Death became a daily visitor, and fear consumed the population. Every explosion was a bullet fired not just at institutions, but at the heart of Colombia itself, a brutal reminder that the price of challenging Escobar was blood. Behind the scenes, the assassins' list grew. Judges who supported extradition faced brutal executions. Police officers and prosecutors were gunned down, their bodies left as warnings for those who dared to follow their path. Politicians received threats that promised death if they did not relent. The campaign of violence was as much psychological as it was physical. It spread like a poison, infecting trust, paralyzing decision-making, and twisting public perception. For many Colombians, the government seemed powerless, overshadowed by a man whose reach stretched into every corner of society. Yet, there were those who refused to bow. Brave law enforcement officers, judges, and politicians stood firm, driven by the belief that extradition was the key to breaking the cartel's grip. They worked in the shadows, facing constant danger, knowing that one misstep could be their last. But the cost was high. Families lived in fear. Children were hidden away. Safe houses became prisons. Every victory was tempered by loss. As the terror escalated, so did Pablo's paranoia. He tightened security around himself and his family, moving frequently, hiding in secret locations. His empire, once built on boldness and bravado, now operated in shadows and whispers. Even allies questioned the path he had chosen. Some feared the violence would bring not just his downfall, but the collapse of Colombia itself. The world watched, horrified and helpless, as a nation teetered on the brink. In the end, the extradition crisis was more than a political battle. It was a war for Colombia's soul. A war ignited by a man who would rather burn cities than surrender to a prison cell thousands of miles away. And as the explosions echoed through the night, one question haunted every Colombian: How long could this nightmare last before the darkness consumed them all? Chapter 12. Narcoterrorism Unleashed. Colombia burns. The night sky cracked open with fire. A passenger plane, filled with innocent souls, families, businessmen, children, erupted midair. Metal twisted, screams were cut short, and flames swallowed the darkness. This was no accident. It was a message written in death. A message that echoed across Colombia, shaking its very foundations. The country had crossed a terrifying threshold. Colombia was no longer just fighting drug trafficking. It was fighting a war defined by terror. Pablo Escobar's fury, once simmering beneath the surface, had exploded into a relentless campaign of violence known as narcoterrorism. This was no longer about smuggling cocaine. It was about crushing a nation under fear's iron heel. The airplane bombing was the grim crescendo of years of escalating violence. It wasn't just an attack on one man. It was an attack on the very heart of the Colombian state. The target, a justice minister who had dared to push extradition laws, threatening Escobar's fortress of impunity. His death was meant to silence resistance and terrorize a nation into submission. The skies became a battleground. Airports transformed into militarized zones. Security tightened, but paranoia thrived. Every flight was met with suspicion. Every passenger's glance was heavy with dread. The very idea of travel turned into a gamble with fate. Colombians began to understand that no place was safe. Not their homes, not their workplaces, not even the skies above. The streets, once filled with the sounds of daily life, now echoed with gunfire and sirens. Explosions tore through city centers. Government buildings were reduced to rubble. Public spaces became graves. The violence was strategic, precise, and brutal. Pablo Escobar's war machine was designed to dismantle the state's will, to break its backbone by targeting those who dared to oppose him: politicians, judges, police officers, and anyone who stood in his way. The doctrine was simple and terrifying: submit to the cartel's demands or face obliteration. Judges who ruled against drug traffickers found themselves on death lists. Prosecutors disappeared without a trace. Police officers were hunted like animals, their families threatened, their homes torched. The rule of law was no longer a shield, it was a target. As fear tightened its grip, normal life crumbled. Schools shut down early. Businesses closed their doors. People stayed indoors, eyes wary, hearts pounding. The city's heartbeat slowed to the rhythm of fear. Families were torn apart by violence and uncertainty. Children who once played freely in the streets now huddled inside. The sound of helicopters overhead a constant reminder of danger. Mothers whispered prayers, hoping the next knock at the door wouldn't bring death. But for Pablo, this was power at its peak. He wielded terror like a king's scepter, commanding obedience through fear. His brutal campaign was designed not just to eliminate enemies, but to crush hope, to silence voices of dissent, and to sow distrust in the government's ability to protect its people. His influence stretched into every corner of Colombia's society. Corruption became the soil where his power took root and grew. Officials who once stood against him were bought, coerced, or killed. The very institutions meant to uphold justice were corroded from within. Yet, even as the violence escalated, Escobar's image was a paradox. To the poor and desperate, he remained a Robin Hood figure, building schools, soccer fields, and clinics where the government had failed. He gave money to the forgotten, showing a face of generosity amid a backdrop of terror. For some, he was a protector. For many, a nightmare. Behind the lavish parties and exotic animals, behind the sprawling estates, was a man obsessed with control. His empire was a fortress built not just on cash, but on blood and fear. The narco-terrorism campaign reached its zenith with a series of coordinated attacks that stunned the world. Bombs detonated in public markets, turning lively hubs into scenes of devastation. Car bombs destroyed courthouses, leaving scars that would last for decades. Entire neighborhoods lived under curfews imposed by violence. The Colombian government, battered and overwhelmed, scrambled to respond. Military forces were deployed to secure cities. Intelligence units intensified operations. But the enemy was elusive, hiding behind civilians, protected by fear, and fueled by billions in drug money. International pressure mounted. The United States stepped up its support with advisors, equipment, and funding. The fight against narco-terrorism became a global mission. Yet, Escobar adapted swiftly. When one smuggling route was shut down, another opened. When one lieutenant was captured, another stepped forward. His network was a hydra. Cut one head, two more would rise. Inside his inner circle, the cracks began to show. Loyalty was eroded by paranoia. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Ambitions and betrayals stirred unrest. The violence that had once forged his kingdom now threatened to consume it. And the Colombian people were caught in the crossfire. Every day was a gamble. Every step outside the door could be the last. Hope flickered dimly beneath the shadows of bombs and bullets. The narco-terrorism unleashed by Pablo Escobar was more than a series of attacks. It was a psychological siege. It aimed to paralyze a nation, to bend it to his will through fear and destruction. As Colombia burned, the world watched in horror. A country rich in culture and spirit was being torn apart by one man's ruthless quest for power. The question that hung over every charred street and shattered building was simple, yet terrifying. How long could Colombia survive under this reign of terror? And as the fires raged on, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a battle for control of the drug trade. It was a battle for the very soul of a nation. The war was far from over, and the flames of narco-terrorism threatened to consume them all. Chapter 13. The Fall of Rivals, Killing the Cali and Bogotá Competition. The night air was thick with tension. A single shot echoed through the alleyway, shattering silence and hope in one ruthless instant. Somewhere, a man's empire crumbled. This was the language of power, violent, absolute, and final. In the brutal world of Colombia's drug trade, Pablo Escobar was a king who refused to share his crown. Around him, rivals grew restless, threats lurking like shadows in the night. The Cali Cartel, once a small flicker in the darkness, had risen with a calculated calmness that challenged Escobar's explosive rule. Bogotá's traffickers carved their own kingdoms, controlling vital routes, their ambition clear and unyielding. But in this deadly game, only one throne would remain. Escobar understood this better than most. His rise had been forged in blood and cunning. He knew that power was never given. It was taken, violently and without mercy. Every rival was an enemy, every alliance fragile, and every breath could be the last. The war to dominate Colombia's cocaine market was ruthless and unrelenting. It wasn't fought with polite negotiations or paper contracts. It was waged in the shadows and on the streets. Ambushes, assassinations, and explosions that ripped through cities like storms. The Cali Cartel, sophisticated and secretive, operated like a phantom menace. Unlike Escobar's overt terror, they preferred manipulation, bribery, and silence. Their wealth grew quietly, their influence creeping into the highest levels of government and business. To many, they were ghosts, untouchable, invisible, deadly. Escobar, however, saw ghosts as targets. His response was swift and brutal. Each attack was a message carved in flesh. Enforcers hunted rival leaders with cold precision. Safe houses were breached. Convoys ambushed. Explosions turned palatial estates into smoldering ruins. Violence was not chaos. It was chess. Each move designed to topple kings and claim their pieces. Bogotá's traffickers, controlling crucial smuggling routes, were no less dangerous. They guarded their territory fiercely, and conflict with Escobar was inevitable. The city became a battleground, its streets stained with the blood of those who dared cross the drug lord's path. Amid the violence, fear was a constant companion. Families lived in dread, knowing that a knock at the door could signal death. Allies whispered warnings in hushed tones. Betrayal lurked in every shadow. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Escobar's inner circle was a fortress of loyalty, but even there, cracks appeared. Paranoia gnawed at men once bound by brotherhood. Some whispered of deals behind backs, others plotted for power. The war wasn't just outside the cartel, it was within. The cocaine trade was more than a business. It was a war for survival, status, and legacy. Money flowed like rivers, but so did blood. Each killed rival was a reminder of the stakes. This was a world where the price of failure was death. Escobar's tactics were merciless. He didn't just eliminate threats, he erased them. Families were targeted, safe havens destroyed, futures extinguished. His reputation for violence spread, instilling terror far beyond his direct reach. Yet, even with all the brutality, he maintained a ruthless code. Loyalty was rewarded lavishly. Betrayal met with swift and merciless retribution. His power was built not just on fear, but on calculated respect, a precarious balance that kept his empire intact. As rivals fell one by one, Escobar's dominion expanded. His control of smuggling routes tightened, his influence in government deepened, and his legend grew. The streets whispered his name in both fear and reverence. But empires built on violence are fragile. The more power he claimed, the more enemies he made. The war for Colombia's cocaine throne was far from over. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Inside his fortress, Escobar faced a moment of uncertainty. Was his reign unshakable, or was the tide turning? The ghosts of rivals past and present circled ever closer. And in the stillness before the next storm, one question haunted the air. Who would be next to fall? Chapter 14. Los Extraditables, the Murderer's Manifesto. A blood-stained pamphlet landed silently on the steps of Bogotá's Supreme Court. Its words were a manifesto of terror, a brutal vow etched in cold ink and colder hearts. "We are Los Extraditables," it declared, "and we will never surrender to extradition." This was no mere threat. It was a declaration of war, a chilling promise that those who dared to send them to the United States would face death. The pamphlet's message rippled through Colombia like a poisonous storm, heralding the rise of a new breed of criminals, drug lords bound not only by commerce, but by a lethal brotherhood. This alliance, forged in fear and blood, united the most violent traffickers in a terrifying crusade against the state and its laws. They were Los Extraditables, the Extraditables, and their war was merciless. For years, Colombia had grappled with the creeping menace of drug cartels. But the fight against extradition transformed that menace into outright chaos. The promise to never be handed over to U.S. prisons became a binding oath, more sacred than life itself. It was a creed that demanded absolute loyalty and justified unthinkable violence. Extradition meant losing control, being torn from the land that birthed their empires, their families, their identities. For Los Extraditables, it was worse than death. It was a fate that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their existence. Their response was brutal and unrelenting. Cities burned under the weight of their fury. Judges who supported extradition laws were hunted like prey. Prosecutors who dared to prosecute vanished in the night, leaving behind empty homes and terrified families. Police officers became targets in an invisible war, their names whispered with dread in the halls of power. Bombs shattered courthouses, turning bastions of justice into ruins. Car bombs detonated in crowded plazas, leaving innocent lives scattered like broken glass. The violence was not indiscriminate. It was surgical, designed to instill terror and dismantle the state's will to resist. In every corner of Colombia, fear tightened its grip. Families barricaded doors, children stopped playing in the streets, and silence became the only refuge. The normal rhythms of life were replaced by the constant drone of helicopters and the piercing wail of sirens. Behind the scenes, Los Extraditables operated with chilling precision. Their alliance was a twisted brotherhood, bound by blood, greed, and a shared refusal to bow to foreign justice. Meetings were held in shadowed rooms, plans whispered in code, and assassinations ordered with ruthless efficiency. Yet, even within this deadly fraternity, distrust festered. Paranoia gnawed at their ranks. Every ally was a potential traitor, every whisper a possible betrayal. The war they waged on the outside mirrored a brutal internal struggle for power and survival. The Colombian government, battered but unbroken, fought back. Special police units were formed, intelligence operations intensified, and international cooperation grew. The war was no longer just a national crisis. It had become a global battle against a new kind of terrorism. But Los Extraditables adapted. They shifted tactics, exploited corruption, and hid behind the very communities that feared them most. Their reach extended deep into politics, law enforcement, and everyday life, blurring the lines between crime and governance. The people of Colombia were trapped in the eye of a storm. Every day brought new violence, new loss, and new questions. How much more could they endure? How long before the nightmare consumed them all? Amid the chaos, a haunting truth emerged. Los Extraditables were not just criminals. They were architects of terror, masters of fear, and builders of an empire fueled by death. And as their manifesto continued to spread its shadow, one question loomed large. Could Colombia ever reclaim its soul from the grip of those who had vowed never to be extradited? The war raged on, and the nation waited for justice, for peace, for an end to the terror that threatened to destroy them all. But the next chapter had yet to be written, and in the silence that followed, only one certainty remained. The fight was far from over. Chapter 15. The Murder of Luis Carlos Galán, Democracy Under Fire. The crowd surged forward, the roar of cheers filling the humid afternoon air. Flags waved, voices raised in hope, and a man stood at the podium, his words sharp as a blade, cutting through decades of corruption and fear. He spoke of justice, of change, of a Colombia free from the iron grip of drug lords. The future seemed possible. And then, the shot rang out. A bullet tore through the celebration, ripping hope apart in an instant. The crowd gasped, screams erupted, and chaos unfolded like a nightmare come to life. The man who dared to challenge the empire was struck down, his dreams silenced forever. This was no random act of violence. It was an assassination ordered by the most feared man in Colombia, Pablo Escobar. The killing of Colombia's leading anti-cartel presidential candidate sent shockwaves far beyond the country's borders. It was a brutal message to a nation struggling to hold on to its democracy. The cartel was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a ruthless political force willing to murder anyone who stood in its way. For the man gunned down, the fight had been more than political ambition. It was a moral crusade against a growing darkness. He had spoken truth to power, exposing the depths of cartel influence in government, promising to dismantle the networks that smothered Colombia in fear and corruption. His campaign rallies were not just political events, they were battlegrounds. Supporters risked their lives to stand beside him, united by the hope of a Colombia cleansed of drug money and violence. But the cartel's reach was long, and its wrath swift. The assassination was meticulously planned. Gunmen lay in wait amid the crowd, blending seamlessly with spectators. Moments before the shot, the man smiled, unaware that death was inches away. The bullet struck with deadly precision, ending his voice but igniting a fire that would not be extinguished. The nation reeled. Mourning turned to outrage. The assassination exposed the fragility of Colombia's democracy, revealing a government at war with itself and with a criminal empire that seemed untouchable. Political leaders were shaken, citizens fearful, and the world watching in horror. The murder was a turning point, one that forced Colombia to confront the harsh reality that its future was caught in a brutal struggle between democracy and narco-terrorism. In the aftermath, investigations unfolded amid threats and intimidation. Witnesses were silenced, evidence vanished, and truth became a dangerous commodity. Yet, the name of the mastermind behind the killing was no secret. Pablo Escobar's fingerprints were on the crime like a signature of fear. This act of political murder underscored the cartel's power to manipulate and destroy. It wasn't just about controlling the drug trade. It was about controlling a nation's destiny through fear and violence. For the family of the slain candidate, the loss was unbearable. A father, a husband, a man who believed in a better Colombia, taken too soon. Their grief was shared by a nation desperate for justice and healing. But justice was elusive. The cartel's shadow loomed large over courts and police forces. Efforts to bring the killers to account were hampered by corruption, fear, and the omnipresent threat of retaliation. Still, the legacy of the murdered candidate endured. His vision inspired others to continue the fight, to speak out against the darkness, even as the cartel's reign seemed unbreakable. The murder was a grim reminder that in Colombia, democracy was under siege. It was a battlefield where ideals clashed with bullets, and where every vote carried the weight of a life. As the nation grappled with loss and fear, one question lingered. Could Colombia survive a democracy under fire? The answer remained uncertain, suspended in a tense silence broken only by the distant echo of footsteps, some seeking justice, others stalking their next target. The war for Colombia's soul was far from over, and the next chapter was yet to unfold. Chapter 16. The search block is born, the hunt begins. A single radio transmission shattered the uneasy calm inside the cramped command center. The room was dimly lit, walls lined with maps, photographs, and scribbled notes. Officers moved with quiet urgency, eyes darting between flickering screens, fingers tapping out coded messages. Outside, Medellin bustled on, unaware that deep within its veins, a war had quietly begun, a war not fought on open battlefields but in shadows, whispers, and sudden violence. The man they hunted was not an ordinary criminal. He was a ghost, a phantom cloaked in legend and fear. His name was whispered in every corner of Colombia, sometimes with reverence, more often with dread. Pablo Escobar, king of cocaine, master of terror, the nation's greatest nightmare. The Colombian government had reached a breaking point. For years, they had watched helplessly as Escobar's empire grew, his money flooding pockets of politicians, police, and judges, his violence silencing opposition with terrifying efficiency. His reach was infinite, like a dark tide that drowned every attempt at resistance. But now, the government had a plan, a desperate gambit. They created a specialized task force, an elite unit known simply as the Search Block. Their sole mission was to find and kill Pablo Escobar. No negotiations, no compromises. It was the birth of a new kind of war. The Search Block was assembled from the country's most skilled officers, men and women hardened by years of battling cartels and corruption. They were soldiers in blue, equipped with the latest technology and backed by American intelligence and resources. Satellite imagery, wiretaps, undercover informants, and helicopters equipped with infrared sensors gave them an edge, but it was never enough. Escobar was a master of disguise and deception. His network was a fortress woven from loyalty, fear, and brutal enforcement. He moved like a shadow, slipping through safe houses, using secret tunnels, disappearing into the mountains or jungle with an almost supernatural skill. Every lead was a thread in a vast, tangled web. Every tip had to be verified, every informant vetted, though betrayal was a constant threat. Escobar's men were everywhere, embedded in police forces, embedded in government offices, embedded in everyday life. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. The men of the Search Block worked around the clock, fueled by frustration and resolve. Their faces showed the toll of sleepless nights and broken lives. Some had lost family members to cartel violence. Others carried the weight of their country's hopes on weary shoulders. Each knew that failure meant more death, more corruption, more despair. Their methods were harsh but necessary. Raids at dawn, ambushes on isolated roads, covert surveillance in Medellin's twisting alleys. Each operation was a step deeper into a maze of danger. The line between law enforcement and warfare blurred as the Search Block became both hunters and soldiers in a shadow war. Escobar's response was savage and calculated. He unleashed a reign of terror that turned cities into battlegrounds. Bombings tore through courthouses and public buildings. Assassinations silenced judges and politicians who dared stand against him. His hitmen, ruthless and invisible, struck with deadly precision. Civilians lived in fear, trapped between the state and the cartels. Every day was a gamble. Which neighborhood would be targeted next? Which family would lose a loved one? The nation's heartbeat was heavy with dread. Amid this chaos, the search block pushed forward, their resolve hardened by every loss. They learned to move like ghosts themselves, silent, efficient, deadly. Intelligence became their lifeline. Each intercepted call a potential breakthrough. Their greatest weapon was information, precise, timely, and actionable. But Escobar was no ordinary foe. He adapted quickly, using counterintelligence to mislead and confuse. He bribed, threatened, and killed with ruthless efficiency. His fortress was not just physical but psychological. He ruled through fear, loyalty, and spectacle. Inside the cartel, paranoia festered. Men once united began to suspect betrayal. The pressure of the search block's pursuit cracked alliances, sowing seeds of distrust. Escobar's grip tightened even as the walls closed in, a king defending his throne with claws and teeth. The war had shifted from drug trafficking to survival. For the search block, every mission was a step into the unknown, sometimes a deadly trap, sometimes a narrow escape. They faced ambushes, landmines, and the ever-present threat of betrayal from within. For Escobar, the hunt was a game of shadows and mirrors. Safe houses were abandoned at a moment's notice. Messages were coded in everyday conversations. Friends became spies, enemies sometimes allies. Survival demanded paranoia and brilliance. The Colombian government watched anxiously as the search block tightened its noose. Public pressure mounted. Families demanded action. The world's eyes turned to Colombia, waiting for justice or further bloodshed. Yet, with every success came retaliation. Bombs exploded with devastating effect. Civilians caught in the crossfire, cities shattered by terror. The war spilled beyond the cartel's strongholds, touching every corner of the nation. For the officers hunting Escobar, the cost was personal. Colleagues were lost in ambushes, assassinations, and brutal confrontations. Each death a reminder of the stakes. Each victory a step closer, but also a step deeper into darkness. The hunt was not just a mission, it was a crucible. It forged men and women into warriors, tested their faith, and demanded sacrifices few could imagine. The line between right and wrong blurred in the fog of war. Justice became a shadowy ideal, often obscured by the necessity of survival. As the search block closed in, a fragile hope blossomed across Colombia. The dream of a future free from the shadow of Escobar seemed within reach. But with every inch gained, the danger grew. The hunter and the hunted were locked in a deadly dance. Each move measured, each moment fraught with peril. The balance of power shifted like sand, unstable and unpredictable. And then, in the silence between raids and gunfire, one truth lingered. This war would not end with a single battle. It was a relentless pursuit, a test of wills that would shape Colombia's fate for years to come. In the dense jungles, the sprawling estates, the bustling cities, the search continued, unceasing, unforgiving. For Pablo Escobar, the world was closing in. For the search block, the hunt had only just begun. The question remained, who would make the final move? The king who refused to fall, or the warriors determined to bring him down? The war raged on, and the fate of a nation hung in the balance. Chapter 17, La Catedral. Pablo builds his own prison. The heavy iron gates closed with a resonant clang, sealing a paradox unlike any prison the world had ever seen. Behind those walls stood a fortress built not to punish a criminal, but to preserve a king. This was not a cage made of cold steel bars and broken dreams. It was a palace, a sanctuary, a throne room. A place where Pablo Escobar was both prisoner and ruler, master and captive. The story of La Catedral began not with law enforcement's victory, but with a compromise steeped in desperation and hubris. Colombia was bleeding. Years of relentless violence, bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings had exhausted the government's will and resources. The war against Escobar's cartel had grown into a grinding, bitter conflict with no end in sight. The drug lord had become an almost mythical figure, elusive, ruthless, invincible. Then came the deal that shocked the nation. After a calculated surrender, Escobar negotiated terms that no other prisoner had ever dreamed of. He would turn himself in, but only if he could build and control his own prison, a place where he could live with dignity and continue his reign. The government, under immense pressure and weary from war, agreed. Thus, La Catedral was born. Perched on a remote hillside overlooking Medellin, La Catedral was a marvel of contradictions. To the outside world, it was a prison, a symbol of law and order. But inside, it was Escobar's personal kingdom. The compound was lavish, boasting sprawling gardens, a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, and living quarters that rivaled luxury homes. Escobar's taste for opulence was on full display. Marble floors, plush furnishings, and panoramic views of the city he once ruled with terror. Guards wore uniforms that resembled private security rather than prison officers, fiercely loyal and well-paid by the cartel's immense wealth. Visitors came and went freely, friends, family, business associates, even enemies under uneasy truce. La Catedral was less a place of punishment and more a gilded fortress. The irony was brutal. Here was a man responsible for thousands of deaths, hiding behind the facade of incarceration, continuing to operate his criminal empire with near impunity. For many Colombians, it was a bitter humiliation. For the government, it was a dangerous gamble. But what the world did not see was what happened inside those walls after the cameras left. Behind the glamour and the parties, La Catedral was a theater of cruelty, betrayal, and blood. The prison was a palace of shadows, where violence was law and mercy was a myth. Escobar's enemies, rivals, traitors, informants, were brought here not for justice, but for execution. Torture chambers hid behind ornate doors. Whispers of screams echoed through hidden corridors. Men who dared defy Escobar vanished without a trace. The walls absorbed secrets too dark to speak aloud. The prisoners who lived here were not ordinary inmates. They were pawns, captives in a deadly game where loyalty was bought with blood and betrayal meant a swift death. The guards were executioners, the wardens puppet enforcers. This was Escobar's world, a brutal echo of the kingdom he ruled outside. The government's acquiescence to this prison was a reflection of Colombia's desperation and corruption. Officials turned a blind eye to the horrors inside, blinded by the hope that Escobar's surrender would bring peace. But La Catedral was a facade, a thin veil hiding a ruthless warlord continuing to pull strings from behind bars. Escobar's time inside was marked by a terrifying blend of arrogance and paranoia. He held lavish parties where the lines between celebration and threat blurred. Cocaine flowed freely, guns were never far away, and his guests were a mixture of loyalists and potential enemies. Yet beneath the surface, he was always watching, always calculating. The prison was wired with surveillance and informants, a kingdom built on fear and control. Escobar never relaxed his guard. Every whisper, every glance was measured, every ally scrutinized for signs of treachery. He ruled his domain with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. Outside, the search block and Colombian authorities grew frustrated. La Catedral was a charade. The man they hunted remained free in all but name, continuing to orchestrate killings and drug shipments. Reports of weapons smuggled inside, secret meetings held under the guise of incarceration, and luxury deliveries only deepened suspicion. The tension between the government's desire to claim victory and the reality of Escobar's freedom simmered dangerously. Public outrage grew as stories of La Catedral's excesses and atrocities leaked. Families of victims, human rights activists, and journalists condemned the deal as a betrayal. But the government was trapped. To revoke Escobar's privileges risked igniting a new wave of violence, retaliation, and chaos. La Catedral was both a prison and a powder keg. Within those walls, cracks began to appear in Escobar's fortress. Rival factions within the cartel grew restless, emboldened by the perception that their leader was vulnerable. The fragile alliances that had sustained his empire trembled under pressure. The tipping point came when the government demanded that Escobar be transferred to a conventional prison. The message was clear: no more concessions. No more palaces for a killer. La Catedral was to be shut down. Escobar refused. For him, La Catedral was not just a prison, it was a throne. To leave was to admit defeat, to lose the carefully constructed illusion of control. His empire depended on the fortress he built with his own hands. The refusal escalated the conflict to a new level. The government prepared for a confrontation that would test the limits of law and power. The search block readied itself for a siege, knowing that inside La Catedral, their enemy was more dangerous than ever. The walls that had once seemed impregnable began to close in. Escobar's kingdom was unraveling, piece by piece. But his resolve was unyielding. The man who had built a drug empire from nothing was not about to surrender his last sanctuary without a fight. La Catedral became a symbol of Colombia's bitter struggle, a microcosm of a nation torn between justice and survival. It stood as a monument to the complexity of fighting a war where the enemy could negotiate, manipulate, and rewrite the rules. As the government tightened its grip, the world watched, waiting for the inevitable showdown. The prison palace, once a sanctuary, was now a battleground where the fate of a drug lord and a nation collided. Inside, the air thickened with tension. Allies whispered of rebellion. Guards exchanged worried glances. The king's court was crumbling, the illusion of control slipping like sand through clenched fists. The question remained, how long could Escobar hold on? How far would he go to defend the fortress that was his last refuge? The answer lay hidden in the shadows of La Catedral, where freedom and captivity were intertwined, and the war for Colombia's soul reached its darkest chapter. The hunt had entered a new phase. The final act was looming, and no one could predict how the story would end. Chapter 18. The Escape, Colombia's greatest embarrassment. The night sky over Medellin was deceptively calm. A thin moon hung low, casting long shadows over the hills where La Catedral, the prison palace built by Colombia's most notorious drug lord, stood like a fortress. Inside, walls lined with marble and steel promised captivity. But the truth was far darker. La Catedral was a gilded cage, and its king was planning an escape that would shock a nation. Months of mounting pressure had built to this moment. The Colombian government, battered by years of violence and corruption, had hoped that Escobar's surrender and imprisonment would mark a turning point. Instead, it became the country's greatest embarrassment. La Catedral was no prison. It was a palace where Escobar continued to wield his deadly influence. The manhunt, the relentless pursuit by the search block and U.S. forces, had faltered. Escobar had bought his freedom behind bars, living lavishly, smuggling weapons inside, and orchestrating assassinations with impunity. International outrage grew, the government's credibility waned, and the fragile peace threatened to shatter. Inside the prison walls, Escobar's paranoia had grown as large as his empire once was. The days of open parties and carefree power were fading. Rival factions stirred, government pressure tightened, and the betrayal of trusted allies loomed like a storm on the horizon. The king knew his gilded cage would soon be a trap. On a quiet night, with only the hum of distant city lights and the whisper of the wind, the plan was set in motion. The escape was no haphazard flight. It was a masterstroke of criminal ingenuity. Escobar's men had spent weeks mapping the prison's blind spots, bribing guards, and preparing secret tunnels. Every detail was calculated, every risk weighed against the stakes. For Escobar, freedom was the ultimate prize, worth any cost. The corridors of La Catedral were dimly lit, silence heavy in the air. Guards, some loyal, others compromised, glanced away as shadows moved swiftly. A hole in the stone, carefully hidden, became the passage to liberty. Through this secret route, Escobar slipped past the watchful eyes of the law. When the alarm finally sounded, it was too late. The king had vanished into the night, leaving behind a prison that was no longer a symbol of justice, but of failure. The news erupted like wildfire. Headlines screamed of government incompetence, corruption, and betrayal. Colombia's image on the world stage was tarnished. The man who had terrorized the country was free once again, at the very moment the nation was desperate for peace. Within the halls of power, chaos reigned. Ministers resigned under pressure. Investigations began, but answers were elusive. Public trust shattered, and the fragile hope for stability slipped further away. The search bloc, battered but resolute, redoubled its efforts. The manhunt intensified, transforming from a pursuit into a full-scale war. Every street corner, safe house, and jungle clearing became a battlefield. Escobar's network mobilized, their leader now a fugitive in the wild once more. The escape was more than physical, it was psychological warfare. Escobar's myth grew. He became a symbol of defiance, a shadow king mocking the state. His followers rallied with renewed fervor, while his enemies scrambled for survival. International support poured in, satellite surveillance, wiretaps, and military advisors flooded Colombia. Helicopters swept the mountains, river patrols scanned the waterways, and intelligence agents infiltrated cartel ranks. The net was tightening. Yet Escobar was a ghost, slipping through cracks, changing faces, moving like smoke through the labyrinthine streets. Trust became a dangerous commodity. Allies were as likely to betray as protect. The war blurred lines between right and wrong, hunter and hunted. Across Colombia, citizens lived in fear and fascination. The man who built an empire on blood and cocaine was now the nation's greatest fugitive. The war escalated beyond law enforcement. It was a fight for the very soul of the country. Inside the search bloc, exhaustion weighed heavy. Officers operated in shadows, chasing rumors and hopes. Families awaited justice, their pain a constant reminder of the stakes. The man responsible for countless deaths remained free, a relentless specter haunting every corner. For Escobar, the escape was survival and spectacle. It was proof that no prison could hold him, no army could break him. He was the predator and the prey, a king slipping free from chains that were never meant to bind him. The stakes soared higher. Every day was a countdown. Every night a gamble. How long could Escobar evade capture? How many more lives would be lost in the desperate chase? The answer lay hidden in the jungles, the cities, and the hearts of those caught in a war they never asked for. The manhunt was no longer a mission. It was a war for Colombia's future. And the world watched, breath held, waiting for the final reckoning. Chapter 19. Los Peeps, the Vigilante Death Squad. The night air hung thick with tension. Somewhere in the shadows, a ruthless force was mobilizing, a force born not of law, but of vengeance. A death squad whose name struck fear like a thunderclap, Los Peeps. To many, they were ghost hunters. To others, they were executioners wrapped in silence and shadows. Their mission was brutal and clear: hunt down Pablo Escobar and dismantle his empire by any means necessary. This was not a war fought with courtrooms or laws. It was a merciless campaign of blood and fire. Los Peeps, short for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged from the darkness like a swarm of locusts, consuming everything tied to the kingpin's reign. Their rise was swift and violent, fueled by hatred, survival, and the desperate calculus of power. Escobar's enemies had long dreamed of his downfall. Rival cartels, particularly the Cali cartel, hungry to reclaim dominance, saw an opportunity. Their pockets deep with drug money, they funneled resources into this clandestine army. But Los Peeps were not just another cartel faction. They operated in the gray space where crime, politics, and covert justice blurred. Backed tacitly by elements within Colombian security forces and shadowy figures from the U.S., Los Peeps embodied the brutal pragmatism of a nation pushed to the brink. They were the embodiment of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, a lethal alliance born from desperation. Their weapons were simple: terror, ruthlessness, and anonymity. In their war against Escobar, no target was too small, no boundary sacred. His family members became fair game. His closest allies vanished in bursts of violence that left neighborhoods trembling. Safe houses exploded in fireballs. Vehicles were riddled with bullets on busy streets. Each strike sent a clear message: there was no refuge in Pablo's world. The faces behind Los Peeps were shrouded in mystery. Some were former guerrillas, others ex-police or mercenaries with no allegiance beyond the paycheck and the cause. Their identities were secrets, their methods brutal but surgical. They operated without mercy, without trial, turning the hunt for Escobar into a blood-stained game of shadows. For ordinary Colombians, the rise of Los Peeps was both a curse and a strange relief. The streets were soaked with violence, but there was a grim hope that the kingpin's stranglehold was weakening. Yet, the cost was unimaginable. Innocent lives caught in crossfire, families shattered by grief, communities terrorized by the ceaseless pulse of revenge. Los Peeps became a ghost story whispered in alleys, a nightmare stalking the corridors of power. Their legend grew with every assassination, every vanishing, every blaze set under the cloak of darkness. To Escobar, they were the ultimate threat, a shadow army eroding his empire from within, striking at the heart of his power. The government's role was murky. Officially, Colombia condemned vigilante justice. Unofficially, the state's fingers intertwined with Los Peeps, a tacit acknowledgement that conventional means had failed. In this dance of duplicity, laws bent, rules blurred, and morality became a casualty. The impact was seismic. Los Peeps fractured the cartel's fragile unity, sowing distrust among allies, turning friends into foes. Escobar's once impervious network began to crack, paranoia blossoming like a poison flower. Every whisper became a threat, every shadow a potential assassin. Yet, with every success came a deeper darkness. Los Peeps did not discriminate with justice. Rival cartels sometimes manipulated the squad to eliminate enemies under the guise of anti-Escobar operations. Innocents disappeared, vengeance often masqueraded as retribution. Amid the carnage, a chilling question remained. How far could a nation descend when the lines between justice and revenge erased? Los Peeps were a symptom of Colombia's fractured soul, caught in a brutal war where survival demanded crossing every line. For Escobar, the rise of Los Peeps was a nightmare realized. The kingpin who had once ruled with iron fists now found himself hunted not only by the law, but by ghosts who operated in silence and blood. His empire, vast and powerful, was being dismantled piece by piece, each loss a wound festering in the night. The hunt became relentless, a game of cat and mouse where the stakes were life or death. Los Peeps pushed Escobar into hiding, forcing him into ever smaller corners of his crumbling kingdom. The man who had once laughed at armies was now running from shadows. Yet, even as the noose tightened, Escobar's myth endured. To some, he was still a Robin Hood. To others, a demon on the run. Los Peeps' violence tore at the fabric of Colombia, but it also set the stage for an end that was as inevitable as it was brutal. In the blood-soaked streets, beneath the endless rain and overcast skies, the war raged on. Los Peeps, relentless and anonymous, moved like phantoms. Each strike was a sentence, each disappearance a verdict. And with every breath, Colombia edged closer to the violent finale of a kingpin's reign. The chapter closes as the hunt reaches a fever pitch. The kingpin's empire is crumbling, but the ghosts that chase him do not rest. A nation torn between hope and horror braces itself, because in this war, the final shot is still waiting to be fired. Chapter 20, A City at War, Medellin's Final Days. The streets of Medellin were no longer a place for peace. They had become a battleground, a city under siege, where the air trembled with the roar of gunfire and the shudder of explosions. It was a city gripped by terror, a living nightmare where every shadow could hide a killer, every corner could erupt in violence. The war had come home. At the heart of this chaos was a crumbling empire, once untouchable, now bleeding from every wound. The kingpin who had ruled with iron fists was losing control. Medellin, his kingdom, was fracturing beneath the weight of his enemies, his own mistakes, and a relentless government that refused to back down. The violence was unrelenting. Car bombs shattered quiet neighborhoods, sending shards of glass and bodies into the air. Innocent bystanders, caught in the crossfire, became grim statistics. Streets that had once buzzed with life now echoed with sirens and whispers of death. The city was militarized. Checkpoints sprung up like weeds. Soldiers and police patrolled with rifles raised, Helicopters circled overhead. Walls became battlegrounds painted with bullet holes and blood. The population lived in fear, trapped between the fury of a drug lord desperate to hold on and the desperate attempts of authorities to regain their city. Inside this storm, the Kingpin's empire was fraying. His trusted lieutenants vanished in bursts of violence. Allies turned against each other, and loyalty was a currency in rapid decline. The fear that once enforced obedience now bred betrayal. Neighborhoods once loyal to the Kingpin's promise of protection and prosperity became battlegrounds. The Robin Hood myth crumbled beneath the weight of car bombs and assassinations. Children played among the ruins. Mothers whispered prayers for safety. Medellin was a city at war with itself. Every street battle was a clash of titans, gunmen armed with automatic weapons, hit squads executing swift assassinations, rival factions vying for scraps of power. The violence spilled over into everyday life, turning ordinary routines into acts of survival. The drug lord's enemies grew bolder, their attacks more precise. Government forces, fueled by international aid and determination, pushed harder into the cartel strongholds. They targeted finances, disrupted supply routes, and captured key operatives. The walls closing in were not just physical, but psychological. The Kingpin himself became increasingly isolated. Trust turned into paranoia. Decisions were made in shadows. Orders given in whispers. The man who once commanded an empire from opulent palaces now hid in makeshift safe houses, a fugitive in his own city. Medellin's final days under his reign were marked by desperation and decay. The empire's cash flow slowed, smuggling routes were compromised, and public support waned under the crushing weight of violence. The lavish lifestyle that once dazzled was replaced by fear and uncertainty. Yet even in this chaos, moments of humanity flickered. Stories emerged of people risking everything to protect neighbors, of families caught between warring factions clinging to hope. Medellin was not just a city of violence. It was a city of resilience, struggling to breathe beneath the storm. As the government tightened its grip, the Kingpin prepared for the inevitable. His options dwindled. Escape seemed impossible, surrender unthinkable. The war for Medellin's soul had reached its crescendo. The final battle was coming. The streets, soaked with blood and fear, waited silently. Medellin stood on the edge of an abyss, and the question hung heavy in the air: who would claim the city's future? The city held its breath as a once mighty empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The war was not just for control. It was for survival, for redemption, and for the soul of Medellin itself. And in the shadows, the Kingpin's fate was being sealed. Chapter 21. The DEA and CIA joined the chase. International pressure mounts. The chase was no longer confined to Colombia's borders. The Kingpin's shadow had stretched across oceans and continents, and now, the full weight of American power was bearing down on him. A silent war was underway, one fought not in open streets but in the darkened rooms of intelligence agencies, where surveillance cameras clicked, phones were tapped, and every whispered conversation could be the thread that unraveled a vast empire. The U.S. government had decided. Escobar was a menace not just to Colombia, but to the entire world. The drug trade he controlled was poisoning neighborhoods from Miami to New York. Innocent lives were being shattered by addiction, violence, and corruption, and the pressure to end his reign was relentless. The DEA and CIA, two of America's most secretive and skilled agencies, converged on the hunt with an intensity that blurred the lines between law enforcement and covert warfare. This was no ordinary investigation. It was a sprawling, complex web of wiretaps, informants, and reconnaissance missions. Agents worked behind the scenes, their presence invisible but their impact seismic. Satellites tracked shipments of cocaine as they moved like ghost ships through the Caribbean, while undercover operatives infiltrated networks, collecting fragments of information that could lead to the Kingpin's downfall. The stakes were immense. Every piece of intelligence was a potential breakthrough, every intercepted call a glimpse into a dangerous mind. The agencies operated in the shadows, weaving an intricate net designed to tighten around Escobar's neck until escape was impossible. Technology became their silent ally. Sophisticated surveillance equipment intercepted phone lines, decoded coded messages, and monitored suspicious activity with a precision never seen before in the war on drugs. This wasn't just police work, it was high-stakes espionage, a battle of wits and technology against a man who had built an empire on secrecy and fear. Yet even with the best tools, the hunt was grueling. Escobar was a master of disguise and deception. He changed locations like a chameleon, moving between safe houses, using lookalikes, and employing layers of security that tested every ounce of patience and skill in the agents chasing him. The labyrinthine jungle terrain and sprawling urban slums became his allies, hiding him in plain sight. American agents felt the pressure acutely. Each day brought new leads and dead ends. Success is shadowed by brutal losses. They worked alongside Colombian forces, sharing intelligence, but often frustrated by the country's fractured institutions and widespread corruption. Trust was fragile, and every ally could be a double agent. The psychological toll was immense. For the agents, this was not just a mission. It was a war against a monster who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. Every intercepted call, every photograph, every informant's tip was a step closer to justice. But the closer they got, the more dangerous the game became. As surveillance tightened, Escobar's paranoia deepened. He knew the noose was closing, but his bravado never wavered. He sent messages of defiance, taunted authorities, and orchestrated violent retaliations that shook the very foundations of Colombia's cities. His empire was fragile yet ferocious, a powder keg waiting to explode. Behind the scenes, American intelligence strategized with deadly precision. They coordinated raids, targeted key cartel finances, and disrupted supply lines, hoping to starve the beast. Their work was meticulous, slow-moving, but unstoppable, like a glacier inching forward, reshaping the landscape of crime. But there was a deeper complexity. Political pressures in both countries added layers of urgency and caution. The U.S. government demanded results, while Colombian leaders balanced fragile peace talks and rampant violence. The international spotlight bore down, exposing the messy, dangerous dance of politics and power. Amid this tension, the hunt intensified. Safe houses were raided, networks dismantled, and allies turned informants under the weight of evidence and threat. Escobar's empire began to show cracks, small but telling, signaling that even the most ruthless kingpin could not withstand the combined might of two nations. The chapter closes with a chilling question. In a world of shadows and secrets, who will make the fatal mistake? Which slip will lead to capture? And will justice come before more blood is spilled? The chase was far from over, but the noose was tightening. The war had become international, relentless, and inevitable. The kingpin's days were numbered. Chapter 22. The betrayals. Allies turn into enemies. A single whisper. One cracked loyalty. The fragile web of trust that once held an empire together began to unravel, thread by thread. In the world of shadows Pablo had built, betrayal was the deadliest weapon, sharper and more poisonous than any bullet. The man who had once commanded armies found himself hunted not just by enemies, but by those he once called brothers. The crack appeared suddenly, like the first fissure in a dam. A trusted lieutenant vanished overnight, leaving behind secrets too heavy to bear. Another ally was caught in a covert sting, eyes haunted by the weight of confession. The empire's walls, once impenetrable, now showed signs of rot, corrosion from within, far more devastating than any external assault. The kingpin's paranoia blossomed like a dark flower. Every glance became suspicion, every shadow a potential traitor. The tight circle of confidence dissolved into isolated islands of fear. Those who stayed close whispered in hushed tones, afraid that their words would carry back to a man who had no tolerance for disloyalty. The world of betrayal within the cartel was a ruthless chess game, where pawns turned into queens with a single secret. The stakes were survival, the price was death. Each defector handed the authorities a key to the kingdom: names, locations, methods, the blueprint for destruction. The manhunt sharpened as the veil of silence was ripped away. Trust was currency that evaporated in the heat of fear. Deals once forged in blood were broken with a whispered promise of protection from law enforcement. The cartel's once impervious code of silence, omerta, cracked under the relentless pressure of wiretaps, raids, and looming prison sentences. For those who betrayed the kingpin, the path was steeped in desperation and calculation. Some turned informants to save their own skins, others to settle old scores, and a few for the faint hope of redemption. Each story was layered with regret and fear, the shadow of reprisal always looming large. Inside the sprawling empire, rumors of betrayal sowed chaos. Trust evaporated like morning mist, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. A trusted ally could be a double agent. A secret meeting could be a trap. The kingpin's reign was no longer about power. It was about survival in a collapsing world. The scars of betrayal were not just practical, but deeply personal. Friendships severed, families torn apart by suspicion. The emotional toll was immense. Men who once laughed and shared fortunes now eyed each other across the table like strangers. The kingpin's isolation grew with every defection. Yet, even as alliances crumbled, some loyalty stubbornly remained. A few stood fast, bound by fear, respect, or the unspoken understanding that without the kingpin, there was nothing. These remaining allies became guardians in a fortress besieged by doubt. The betrayals altered the very fabric of the cartel's operations. Logistics were disrupted, communication broken, and financial networks exposed. The once seamless machine groaned under the weight of exposure. Every intercepted call, every secret revealed, chipped away at the empire's foundation. Law enforcement tightened their grip, fueled by inside information that turned the tide. Safe houses were raided with surgical precision. Couriers were captured and flipped. The kingpin's world contracted, territories lost, trust shattered, options shrinking like the setting sun. The psychological warfare was brutal. The kingpin struggled to differentiate friend from foe, often reacting with ruthless violence to perceived disloyalty. Executions became frequent, both as punishment and warning. But fear bred more betrayal, a vicious cycle spiraling out of control. The kingpin's empire was no longer a fortress. It was a battlefield strewn with landmines of suspicion. Each step forward risked a deadly explosion from within. The man who had once controlled an empire with a whisper now grappled with ghosts in his own ranks. The betrayals left a question hanging in the air. How long could a kingpin survive when his kingdom was crumbling from the inside? The walls were closing in, not just from enemies but from the shadows of those he once trusted. The final act was approaching, but the script was unknown and fraught with peril. As the chapter closes, the viewer is left on the edge of uncertainty. In a world where loyalty is bought and sold like contraband, who will stand firm? Who will break? And when the kingpin finally falls, will it be by a bullet or by the blade of betrayal? The empire's fate rested not just on battles fought in the streets, but on the quiet, deadly betrayals whispered behind closed doors. Chapter 23, The Last Hideout, Escobar's Final Hours. A single phone call, a whispered tip. The labyrinth of surveillance had finally found its prize. It was December 2nd, 1993, a day destined to be etched in the history of Colombia, a day when the hunter closed in on the hunted. In a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Medellin, a fortress disguised as a safe house hid the world's most feared drug lord, a man whose shadow had darkened continents. The city was thick with tension. Every street corner, every rooftop, held eyes, watching, waiting, breathing with anticipation. The government's elite search bloc, backed by the intelligence of American agencies, had followed the trail through months of bloodshed, betrayal, and secrets. They knew the stakes. Capture meant the end of an empire, but it also risked a final violent storm. Inside the safe house, the air was heavy. Time moved with an unbearable weight. The man at its center was no longer the untouchable kingpin. He was a man cornered, a fugitive with a kingdom crumbling at his feet. His breathing was steady but sharp, each sound magnified in the silence of his last refuge. The safe house itself was a paradox. On the surface, it looked ordinary: brick walls, barred windows, a simple courtyard. But inside, it was fortified. Guards paced the perimeter like ghosts, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of betrayal or attack. It was a cage of his own making, luxury shackled by fear. Every moment was a fragile thread stretched taut. Outside, agents communicated in whispers, triangulating positions, coordinating movements. Surveillance drones hummed above, cameras caught every flicker of movement. The noose was tightening, invisible but suffocating. As dawn approached, the tension erupted. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the morning calm, sharp, relentless. The chase was on. The fugitive darted through the house, heart pounding, instincts razor-sharp. His mind raced faster than his legs, calculating escape routes, gauging chances, weighing betrayals. He was a hunted animal, clever, desperate, deadly. The neighborhood erupted into chaos. Shots echoed, windows shattered, civilians ducked for cover as the final act of a decades-long drama unfolded. The man who once controlled armies now fought for every breath. His empire was gone, only survival remained. The agents advanced methodically, aware that the fugitive was cornered but dangerous. Each step was calculated, each decision a gamble. The safe house was a maze of shadows and secrets, hiding a man who refused to go quietly. The odds were shifting with every heartbeat. Inside, memories flashed: the rise, the power, the betrayal. The lavish parties, the bloody reprisals, the constant dance with death. Now, all of it boiled down to a single moment. The fugitive's defiance was palpable, a final roar before silence. Gunfire flared again, this time closer, more frantic. The man burst through a wall, desperate to escape through the maze of alleys. Agents pursued, relentless. The streets became a battlefield, a cat-and-mouse game where each corner might hide salvation or death. The sun crept higher, casting harsh light on the shattered remnants of a fallen empire. Neighbors watched, hearts pounding, as the legend of terror moved through their streets. Some rooted silently for the kingpin's end. Others feared the violence that followed him like a storm cloud. Finally, it ended. A single bullet echoed, a sound that would resonate through history. The kingpin fell, his life extinguished in a blur of smoke and dust. The man who had once ruled from shadows was now a ghost, his empire reduced to whispers and ashes. But the aftermath was not peace. Questions hung heavy. Was it justice? Retribution? Or the closing chapter of a tragic saga that had consumed a nation? The final moments were shrouded in mystery, rumors swirling about betrayals, mischances, and the exact circumstances of his death. The city exhaled, but the scars remained. Medellin had survived the storm, but the wounds ran deep. The kingpin's death marked an end and a beginning, a fragile hope for renewal shadowed by the dark legacy of violence and corruption. As the chapter closes, the viewer is left suspended between relief and reflection. The kingpin's final hours were a whirlwind of desperation and fate. His empire may have fallen, but the echoes of his reign continue to haunt Colombia's streets and the world beyond. The story was over, but the legend was just beginning. Chapter 24: Death on the Rooftop, the End of the King. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the fractured city. The air was thick with tension, electric and suffocating. On a crumbling rooftop in Medellin, a chase reached its brutal climax. The man who had once ruled with an iron fist, whose name was whispered with equal parts fear and awe, was running out of time, running out of options. And then, a gunshot shattered the stillness. The king was dead. The final moments were a whirlwind of desperation and violence. The chase was not just a physical pursuit. It was the collapse of an empire, the unspooling of a reign built on blood and betrayal. Every heartbeat echoed with the weight of a nation's pain and relief. The world held its breath as a legend met his end. The rooftop, battered and worn, became the stage for a final act heavy with symbolism. Here, above the streets he once ruled, The drug lord faced the judgment of the forces that had hunted him for years. Yet, questions lingered even in death's shadow. Who fired the fatal shot? Was it the relentless search block, Colombia's specialized anti-drug task force? Or perhaps Los Peeps, the vengeful vigilantes fueled by their own thirst for justice and revenge? Or did the king himself choose to end his story with a bullet, a desperate final act of control? The ambiguity of that moment would fuel speculation for decades. It was a fog thick with mystery, where truth and myth intertwined. Those who witnessed the chase told stories laced with fear and awe of a man refusing to fall quietly, a man whose will burned brighter than the bullets chasing him. In those last seconds, the king's world shrank to a series of fragmented images, concrete beneath feet pounding in frantic escape, the cold metal of a gun pressed against skin, the pounding rhythm of a heart fighting for breath. Time fractured, slowed, and snapped. Behind the scenes, the forces closing in were themselves caught in a web of tension and uncertainty. Each member of the search block carried the weight of a nation's hopes and the burden of past failures. They were soldiers in a war not just for control, but for Colombia's soul. To some, the kill was justice. To others, it was a grim necessity in a battle that had consumed too many lives. Los Peeps, the shadows themselves, operated outside the law, a deadly force born from vengeance and desperation. Their presence blurred the line between justice and revenge. They were not bound by rules, but driven by a brutal code. Kill or be killed. The suspicion that they might have pulled the trigger added a dark layer to the king's death, turning the moment into a violent puzzle with missing pieces. And then there was the haunting possibility. The man who controlled so much, who had evaded capture so long, might have chosen to seize his own fate. A bullet in the temple, an act of final defiance. The ultimate refusal to be taken alive, to surrender control in any way but his own. As the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, the rooftop lay silent, an unspoken witness to a violent end. Below, the city grappled with the shock and the aftermath. Some cheered, seeing liberation. Others mourned, fearful of the vacuum left behind and the chaos it might unleash. The king's death was more than an event, it was a turning point. The final chapter of a story that had reshaped Colombia and rippled across the globe. Yet, the questions about that fatal bullet, about who truly ended the king's reign, lingered like a shadow refusing to fade. Was it justice served by the law, or vengeance cloaked in darkness, or the ultimate act of a man desperate to write his own ending? The truth remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. As the chapter closes, the viewer is left suspended between certainty and doubt. The death on the rooftop ended a reign but birthed a legend. The final shot echoed far beyond Medellin's rooftops, into the hearts of a nation and the pages of history, forever marking the end of the king. Chapter 25. The Funeral of a Legend, Mourning a Monster. The city of Medellin held its breath. The streets that had once echoed with gunfire and chaos were now filled with the footsteps of thousands, a human tide flowing through neighborhoods scarred by decades of violence. This was no ordinary funeral procession. This was the farewell to a man whose name had become synonymous with power and terror, generosity and brutality. The kingpin whose empire had risen from the dusty corners of Colombia to the headlines of the world. The coffin was heavy, draped in the colors of a nation divided, yellow, blue, and red. A stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped the city for so long. It was carried slowly through streets where children once played soccer in dirt lots, now littered with bullet casings. Faces lined the sidewalks, eyes moist with tears or burning with anger. The crowd was a mosaic of Medellin's fractured soul. The poor who had known him as a benefactor, the family shattered by his wars, the survivors who carried memories too painful to speak aloud. Among the mourners were mothers clutching worn photographs of sons lost to the violence that had swept the city like a plague. They whispered prayers into the humid air, their voices trembling yet resolute. Old men, their backs bowed by time and grief, traced the edges of the coffin with calloused hands, as if touching the man who had once ruled them could bring some form of closure. Young boys, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear, saw in him a legend whispered by the streets, an almost mythic figure whose generosity had built schools and homes, but whose iron fist had crushed any who dared to stand against him. This was a city caught in a paradox, a people who had loved and hated in equal measure. To some, he was a hero, a man who had risen from poverty and used his immense wealth to create hope where none had existed. To others, he was a monster, a symbol of death, corruption, and the darkest depths of human cruelty. These contradictions thrummed through the crowd like an electric current, setting every heart on edge. The funeral procession moved like a slow-moving storm, winding its way through Medellin's neighborhoods. Soldiers lined the route, faces stern, guns ready, their presence a reminder that the war was not over, only transformed. The Colombian flag fluttered in the hot breeze, tattered from years of conflict, yet still resilient, much like the people themselves. Media helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing every moment. The stoic faces of the military, the tears of the grieving, the shouts of those who wanted justice, and the prayers of those hoping for peace. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, aware that this event was both an ending and a beginning, a final act in a drama that had reshaped the country and would echo for generations. Inside the coffin lay the man who had defined an era, whose name was etched into the dark history of the drug trade. His life was a tapestry woven with contradictions, acts of generosity shadowed by ruthless violence, dreams born from despair, power gained through betrayal and bloodshed. His story was not simply about crime. It was about the price a nation pays when ambition meets lawlessness. The city was alive with whispered conversations. Some mourned not only a man, but the innocence stolen from their youth. Others feared the vacuum left by his death, worried that new warlords would rise from the ashes, eager to claim their share of the bloody spoils. The funeral was a collective reckoning, a moment when Medellin confronted its own scars and wondered what future lay ahead. Behind the scenes, far from the crowds, the death of the kingpin sent shockwaves through the corridors of power. Governments watched carefully, analyzing the fragile balance of control. Intelligence agencies weighed their options, knowing that while one man was gone, the war on drugs was far from over. The complex networks of trafficking and violence persisted like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more would grow. For many, the funeral was a catharsis. It was a chance to say goodbye not just to a man, but to a chapter of darkness that had consumed too many lives. Yet, it was also a reminder that the legacy of violence did not die with one man. The seeds of conflict were sown deep in the soil of Medellin, nurtured by poverty, corruption, and desperation. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, the crowd grew silent. The weight of loss settled like a heavy fog. Prayers rose, mingling with the humid air, and for a moment, the city seemed to hold its collective breath, mourning a man, a myth, a monster. Some saw him as a tragic hero, others as a cautionary tale, but all understood that his story was inseparable from their own. In the days that followed, Medellin struggled to find balance. The violence that had defined the kingpin's reign began to ebb, but the scars remained. Communities started the slow, painful work of healing, torn between the desire to forget and the need to remember. The man's death marked an end, but also a new beginning, an opportunity to rebuild, to redefine, to reclaim the streets from the shadows. The funeral was a moment frozen in time, a testament to a life lived on the razor's edge between infamy and reverence. It was a story of power, loss, and the enduring struggle of a city caught between darkness and light. Medellin, battered but unbroken, faced the future with cautious hope. This chapter closes not with answers, but with a question. How does a city heal after the reign of a king? How do the echoes of a violent past shape the dreams of tomorrow? The funeral was a final farewell, but the legacy of the kingpin and the story of Medellin was far from over. Chapter 26. Legacy of Blood, the shadow Pablo left behind. The night air was thick with tension, heavy as a fog that refuses to lift. A city, a nation, and an entire world were still grappling with the aftermath of a man whose name had become a byword for violence, ambition, and unchecked power. The ghost of a kingpin lingered, a shadow cast so long that it stretched far beyond his death. He was gone, but the world he shaped remained, twisting and turning in ways no one could fully control. From the blood-soaked streets of Medellin to the polished boardrooms of international policy, the legacy of the cocaine king was written in contradictions. A legacy forged in fire and soaked in blood, yet oddly woven into the fabric of culture, economy, and politics, both in Colombia and across the globe. His empire had been dismantled, his body buried, but the impact of his reign reverberated. Drug trafficking didn't end with him. Instead, the violent kingdom he built fractured and scattered, giving rise to new cartels, new violence, and new wars. The so-called King of Cocaine had been only the first act in a brutal drama that would play out for decades. Colombia's struggle with narco-violence evolved into a battle of identities. For some, he was a monster, a symbol of everything that went wrong, the architect of pain and corruption. For others, he remained a folk hero, a man who gave voice to the voiceless, built schools and homes, and challenged a system they felt had abandoned them. This duality was a wound in Colombia's collective conscience, an open question with no easy answer. On the political stage, the shadow of the kingpin reshaped Colombia's policies and international relations. Governments strengthened anti-drug laws, deployed militarized campaigns, and aligned more closely with the United States in a shared war on drugs. Yet the fight was Sisyphean. For every drug lord toppled, dozens more emerged from the jungle's shadows, fueled by poverty, corruption, and global demand. The man's story infiltrated pop culture with a strange intensity. Documentaries, novels, and TV shows spun tales of his rise and fall, painting him as everything from a ruthless tyrant to a tragic antihero. Netflix series brought the narrative to millions worldwide, blending fact with myth and complicating public perceptions. His life became a spectacle, a modern legend framed in sharp contrasts of power and vulnerability. The kingpin's influence seeped into the darker corners of society, inspiring a new breed of narco-states, regions where cartels wielded power equal to governments, where fear was currency, and where violence dictated the rules. In these fractured landscapes, the ghost of the cocaine lord was not a distant memory, but a living presence, a blueprint for ambition turned deadly. Yet, amid the chaos, Colombia began to transform. Communities resilient in the face of hardship sought peace and prosperity. Efforts to dismantle cartels combined with social programs aimed to heal a nation wounded by decades of conflict. But the scars remained deep. The legacy of blood was not just a history lesson. It was a present reality. Behind every policy debate, every headline about cartel violence, and every Netflix episode dramatizing the cocaine war, lay a fundamental question. How does a country recover from a man who controlled life and death with equal ease? How does a society untangle itself from the web of fear and corruption spun over decades? The answer was neither simple nor clean. It was a slow, painful process, one marked by small victories and heartbreaking setbacks. Colombia's story was one of endurance, a testament to a people who refused to be defined solely by violence. Yet the kingpin's shadow continued to loom, a reminder of the fragile line between power and destruction. As the sun set on the last chapter of his life, a new dawn struggled to rise, one where Colombia faced the monumental task of reclaiming its soul. The legacy left behind was a warning etched in blood and ambition. The seductive pull of power, the cost of violence, and the price paid by generations caught in between. And so the story remains unfinished. A tale of a man who built an empire of white gold and left behind a world forever changed. His ghost walks still, in the whispered fears of mothers, in the bold dreams of youths, and in the flickering screens that replay his legend. The shadow of the kingpin stretches on, long and unyielding, across the hills and valleys of Colombia and beyond. The world may have thought it closed the book with his death, but the story, dark and complex, pulses on, a haunting reminder that some legacies are written not just in history books, but in the very heartbeats of those who survive.